for the socialist economics. Stay for the stupid fucking jokes, everybody. Right? You got it right here. Everybody's always right here on the Crucible. Both debaters will have 5 to 7 minute openings. You can yield your time back if you want to yield your time back. You don't have to use the entirety of it for your opening. We're going to open the floor up, pre-engagement. I expect about an hour and a half. This will probably be a very heavy question-laced Q&A. So we'll probably wrap it up around the hour and a half mark into the debate so that we can get to the Q&A. Of course, super chats are always welcome here, and they will be adhered to. Sometimes people want to steer the conversation in the debate, and if you send a large enough super chat, well, sometimes I let you do that just because I'm that way. In this particular case, Rob Noerr, you're the challenger. We're going to let you open. You're up.
All right. So I think that Econoboi and I will have a good discussion here. So I'm not about to bring this up really derisively, but I think this debate starts from conversation we had previously where we talked about all sorts of things. It wasn't really set up as a debate. It was just me and him talking for 4 hours. And in the context of talking about things like Social Security, immigration, and things like that, we brought up Biden's economy and inflation. And Econoboi is someone that seemed to take umbrage with me saying how disastrous that Biden's economy has been. Spoiler alert, it has been disastrous. It's continuing to get worse. But the topic of inflation came up, and through the context of that, Econoboi seemed to suggest that inflation really wouldn't be a big deal by the end of 2022. I said, we'll see. I'll be happy to have that conversation with you. It came up this week that we're having the conversation now that Janet Yellen, Fed chairman, came out and said she expects really bad inflation to continue throughout the year of 2022. The inflation numbers we've seen have been abysmal, 7.9 year to year this year, or this month, or in the month of February, though those CPI numbers are actually going to be far less than the way we used to calculate it. If we use the calculations we had back in the early 80s, it looks like inflation would be closer to 14 or 15% year to year, which shows how disastrous it is. That inflation is going to have a grosser impact on the poor and the working class, who spends a larger percentage of their money and their income on things like gasoline and groceries that we see massively going. Who's at fault for inflation? Well, there are things that Biden's responsible for, and there are things that aren't just Biden. The first reason for this was we had an ailment, and as a result of that ailment, we had lockdowns. People want to blame the ailment for poor economic conditions. The ailment did not cause the poor economic conditions. It was the policies we issued as a result of that, not just in the United States, but worldwide. For example, most of the supply chain lockdowns and things we see were because working class people weren't working as much. But when you looked at the ailment specifically, it wasn't really targeting in horribly severe ways people of a working age, the population that was of the working age. So by forcing productive people to stop and to lock down, and then by injecting a bunch of money into the economy, you started to see the crazy inflation that we're seeing. In addition, and I'm sure Econoboi will bring this up, when you lock down and then open up, in addition to have inserting all this money, demand is going to be very high, but the production hasn't caught up with it because of the lockdown. And so when you have high demand and low production, you're likely to see things like inflation as well. Another reason that Biden's not exclusively to blame is our reliance on imports in the United States. That's why you'll see a part of the reason that inflation is much worse in the United States than in almost every other G20 country, except countries like Russia, Brazil, Turkey, that we don't want to be in the same sentence of when we're talking about inflation or economic pressures. And also it's because the Fed has continued to keep interest rates at zero. This has basically led to an increase in supply of money. In order to solve inflation, they're going to have to massively raise the rates. And by raising the rates, what will happen is that's probably going to cause a recession, stock market losses, and things like that, which will end up hurting poor people as well. But maybe it'll be a more equitable harming because it will also harm wealthy people. So it's really bad. Biden himself is to blame through things of commission and omission. The commission is all of those policies I talked about. Biden's been in office 47 years, and him and his party and the establishment have endorsed all of those and have been the leaders in that, especially the spending. His $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, people tried to compare it to the stimulus that we saw in 2009. However, when you looked at the potential output versus actual output, basically what we saw was the stimulus under Obama was about half of what the deficit between the actual output and potential output of the economy was, whereas the American Rescue Plan is 6 times higher than the deficit of that. And so that's obviously going to risk inflation by injecting so much money. We paid workers to stay at home, which was a pro. The Build Back Better, the massive spending that we saw with that was a massive part of this. And also his signals to the energy industry that relies on futures markets and tea leaf reading that he was going to collapse energy markets, exacerbated energy prices, which affects almost everything in the economy, which also caused massive price increases and inflation. The Fed bet we could we could use all sorts of voodoo jargonistic terms and things like that. The reality is this: when Biden was sworn in office, these numbers are in millions. We had 4.1 and change million dollars in the federal balance sheet. Today, we have over double that, which is 8.9 and change. So when you double the amount of things on the Fed balance sheet, you can't be surprised when you start to see this crazy inflation. We already talked about how inflation hurts the poor and working class. And remember, Econoboi's statement, what he says here is he originally said that he did not anticipate that inflation would really be a problem or that it would be going down by the end of 2022. We'll see people like, I don't know if he'll do this, but we see Biden trying to blame Russia. All of the numbers I talked about were from February before Russia invaded. Russia's invasion might make energy prices and things like that worse. Another reason that Biden, Democrats, and even Republicans that did not allow us to be energy independent are to blame, because it is predictable if you rely on nefarious state actors like Russia for so much of your economy and things like that, that inevitably if things go wrong, it's going to harm the economy. In addition, we see that the petrodollar may be ending. It looks like there could be a block coming up of China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, UAE, India, and others that are going to compete against the petrodollar. If that happens, the disastrous spending policies that I believe people like Econoboi have supported will be even worse, because people will not have faith in the dollar. And that means that when you artificially double the supply within a 2-year period, that will show all across the world, because exporting dollars is what keeps our economy stable. And the last thing I'll say is that despite all of this, despite the fact that we'll be able to see sort of the shirking and blaming stuff, we can see if you massively increase how much you spend and lock down the economy, that there's going to be predictable economic devastation. I was right about this, not because I'm a genius, not because it's my area of expertise or I have degrees in it, because it made sense. And it's tragic to see so many of the people in the economic sector that said, what do you want, grandma to die? And instead initiated these disastrous policies that now the poor and working class are paying for.
Thank you so much, Rob, for that opening statement. Econoboi, you're up. 7 minutes.
Alrighty, I've got 7 minutes. I'm going to try and do my best. Basically, so what I would say with regards to opening up this topic are a few things. So I'm honestly not sure what my exact quote was. I would say that I know that I said that inflation would come down in 2022, and I'm pretty sure I did say that inflation would be kind of a 2022 problem, and then we'd probably see some resolution at the end of 2022. Not necessarily sure how wrong that'll end up being. It depends. There's a lot of moving parts in the economy, and I think it was Unlearning Economics that said maybe during our conversation last week, I think is when he said that obviously predictions in economics are a bit of a fool's game. It's just a very hard thing to do. That doesn't excuse when predictions are wrong or anything like that, but I do think inflation will come down in 2022, and I think the problem will be solved to some extent in 2022. I'd be surprised basically if inflation kept spiraling out of control in general, and I think that what we've seen since basically the Fed started tightening and all this sort of stuff started coming up, we've probably seen some good moves in that regard. And just to respond to a little bit of what Rob said, he mentioned that if we used the calculation that we used in the 1980s, inflation would be a lot higher. Well, at least it's up to Rob to justify why the older definition of inflation is better. I don't think it is. I don't think including home prices probably makes the most sense in an inflation index. There's many reasons why we wouldn't want to include that. I think it's kind of just a poor talking point that I've seen some people reiterate, and I don't really think it's a great one. I think in general we can criticize when definitions of things get changed in economics. For instance, I think that there was criticism of the George Bush administration that changed the poverty line, and then you could necessarily claim that a lot less people or a lot more people fell into poverty, but they just changed the line. Things like that have come up before. And we can argue whether or not it's good or bad that they changed those things, but in general, I don't think that this change with regard to how we measure inflation was bad. Rob said things that we can all certainly agree with, right? Which is that poor people are facing inflation more than the wealthy. Obviously, we can agree with that. I don't think anybody here is pro-inflation in general. One thing that he mentioned was that the pandemic didn't cause the poor economic conditions. It was poor economic planning. In this regard, he's kind of right. I don't think it was poor economic planning, though. So there's obviously a bit of a rock and a hard place here. You can choose between well, we might just let the pandemic run wild and, just have whatever that might end up being, hundreds of millions or billions or however many people infected. I'm not sure what like the increased number of infections would be, the increased number of deaths. And perhaps that would be worth it if the economy were to stay open, and perhaps we wouldn't have as tight an economy as we have now without those lockdowns. But I feel like that's a pretty hard sale. I know that Rob mentioned he was disappointed to see so many economists saying, well, what do you want grandma to die? But I mean, the reality is that is kind of what we were looking at in terms of the lockdowns versus no lockdowns, especially a year before we had a vaccine, whereas today it's probably not as big a deal. So I'm not really sure we can blame to a great extent basically all the world's governments for locking down. This was something that virtually everyone did, right? And it seemed like, based on what I've been able to garner, that all else equal, the lockdowns probably did save a decent number of lives. Not that they were perfect and not that they didn't have their problems, but to me, I'm not sure that the lockdowns wouldn't happen if we could do it over again. In regard to the U.S. spending, I'm not sure there's a great case that the U.S. stimulus caused an incredible amount of the inflation that we're seeing today. There was actually an analysis when inflation started peaking in October of 2021 by the Federal Reserve, which tried to answer this question because it's an important question to answer. Like, did the fiscal stimulus, an unprecedented amount of fiscal stimulus, did that actually cause the inflation that we're seeing today? And it seemed like what they came to was that actually it caused a very marginal amount of the inflation that we see today, not a ton of it. And in general, I'm a little bit, I'm a little bit more likely to believe that analysis because when you look at just the numbers, like forget about what the Fed says, let's look at the numbers. We see that what makes up inflation, right? Well, inflation is a function of money in the economy times the velocity of that money divided by the amount of stuff in that economy, right? And so if we understand that and we look at the amount of money that's created and then the velocity of that money, well, we created a lot of money. That's true through what Rob described, the monetary stimulus and the fiscal stimulus, but the velocity of money is decreased by 30%, right? People aren't spending it as much as you might see. And the consequences of that are a lot less on the CPI side and a lot more on the asset side. So what happens when people don't spend their money? They save it. They put it in investment accounts. And this is where a lot of asset price inflation comes in. That's not a good thing necessarily, but I'm not sure we can necessarily blame all the fiscal stimulus that Trump and Biden are both responsible for the inflation, especially given that the economy was locked down and people probably needed it in general. So I don't really necessarily buy that narrative as much as I would buy the idea that it's probably all the supply chain issues that we're seeing in response to COVID, right? And so I'm just not really not sold on that narrative quite yet. Maybe Rob can sell me on it throughout this debate in general.
The ailment, right? We'll say the ailment.
Oh, the element. Okay. Yeah. We can't say the C word, I guess. But the pandemic, I guess. Hopefully that's an okay word. But that's all I really have to say. I'm looking forward to talking about it. And it should be a fun one. Let's do it.
Okay, guys. Sorry I had to cut in there, Econoboi. I don't like to do that during a person's opening statement.
How dare you, Andrew?
I think that's right. I think the reason was justified. So anyway, guys, the floor is open. Rob, if you want to start with cross-examination, You're welcome to do so.
Sure. Just a couple things to say real quick. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I don't want to, but I don't think there's any evidence that lockdown substantially saved lives. Countries and areas that didn't have substantial lockdowns had very similar death rates, and those death rates are disproportionate. Like the average age of death from ailments is something like 78, 79 years in the United States, UK, and in most of the rest of the world. That's not the working age population. So I don't think those deaths and things like that are the reason that we saw contraction, nor do I see reason that those people were basically locked down anyways. So I don't see any proof that's it. I think one of the reasons that this is an important topic is, and I'm glad that you've admitted that those sorts of lockdowns actually would lead to devastating economic impacts. The question is, was it worth it? And instead of having a sobering conversation on it, we said, well, what do you want grandma to die? And I think that was flippant. And I think now we're seeing the real cost, and we'll continue to see the real cost of this with poor and working class people in the United States and around the world because we treated it so flippantly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that, you frame it as an admission that lockdowns would have bad economic effects. I don't think anybody who was in virtually any world government would say that a lockdown of the economy wouldn't have pretty, you could say catastrophic, you could say negative. I mean, the point is just like pretty adverse economic impacts. Of course, anybody would say that they will. That was obvious based on when the lockdowns actually happened and what happened to the economy. And it was also probably obvious when they started getting, when they started becoming part of that conversation in the first place, lockdowns. And so I don't really know if that's something that was unforeseen. I think that the secondary proof to that would be that the stimulus did happen, right? If nobody thought that lockdowns would have a bad economic impact and we would just springboard right out after the lockdowns, we wouldn't have done any of the stimulus that we did do, right? And so I guess I would disagree with the framing on that.
I think that what this sort of stuff happens all the time, just in general in politics. Predictable things happen through devastating policies that we see people in positions of leadership advocate for, such as, I'll give you an example, defund the police. And then when people are saying like, this is going to lead to increased crime, increased murder rates in the very communities you're trying to solve, when inevitably that happens, they're like, oh, no one said that, no one said defund the police. No one said that wasn't a possibility. If you go back and you look at the conversation from our mainstream media and politicians, overwhelmingly, they were trying to avoid questions of what the harm of the economic lockdowns would be. And they were saying that, oh, it'll just be temporary. It won't be that bad. So I think that you're mischaracterizing exactly. It wasn't that people were like, yeah, absolutely, this will lead to catastrophic impacts. But, oh, well, here's the evidence is why we think it's worth it. They had no evidence. They tried to shame people. And now this entire conversation is basically happening because we shamed people that had a sobering look and said, wait a minute, why would we take a known catastrophe to solve an unknown evil? And to this day, we still have no evidence that lockdowns significantly mitigated damage from the ailment. But we know it hurt the economy a ton.
Yeah, sure. I'm not really, to try and avoid getting on a long, drawn out conversation on lockdowns. I don't agree with the idea that we have no evidence that lockdowns saved anyone's life. I think that there's probably some decent evidence out there that would show quite the opposite. But let's just avoid the lockdown conversation from now and just take it as a known that they did happen and talk about the sort of economic effect. After all, that's kind of the conversation of debate anyway, right? And so,
right, and that's fair, and that's absolutely fair. We could have another debate, maybe a Twitch exclusive on that sort of stuff. But I just wanted to mention that. The other thing, just real briefly, I'll mention.
Yeah, sure.
You said that the definition of CPI that we used for inflation in the 80s, why should we go back to that metric? I'll concede I probably don't know the exact metric and exact changes as much as you do. I'll concede that. But the point is, even if that's the case and we have a better metric today, the metric that we compare and we say worst inflation rate since the 80s, well, that was them using that old metric. And so if they used, let's say that today's metric's better, fine. Then if in the 80s they were using today's metric, the inflation today would still be worse than those metrics that we saw that were being used in the 80s.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't know if that's true. I know that when you go to Fred, and like Fred's just a data repository, but if you go to Fred and you look up CPI, or really if you look up any metric, I think that what you'll see a lot of the times is sometimes when there's a definitional change, they'll include an addendum in the bottom. They'll say like, oh, you've this metric changed in definition between this time and this time, or that at this point, this is when the metric changed. Like for instance, if you were to go to if you were to look up like money stock, like M2 money stock, they'll have a line in there that says, hey, we changed this definition at this point, and from then on, this is kind of what explains such a jump in the data. However, it is the case that sometimes when you change data, the data is available looking backwards as well. So, right, if we just shrunk the amount of things that we're measuring in terms of prices, it's probably not unreasonable that if you were to look this data up, that it's adjusted for that change in definition throughout time. I don't know if that's the case in general, and it's a bit of a side point. I think that the biggest sort of issue, I think in general with that talking point, is just that plainly, I just don't really think it's purely a talking point, essentially, right? That's all it is. The reality is we can make justifiable defenses for why you see that sort of change in the first place. And in general, obviously, the post, even after the Volcker shock of the 1970s, the inflation that you saw even under the Reagan economy was still relatively high, sure. But I'm not really sure I'm not sure that's a great comment on like where we are currently with regards to inflation. I think that my general statement that I'd love to get into with regards to inflation is that I would say that it's mostly because of the supply shocks that are mostly because of the lockdowns. And I'm not sure that like government spending and stuff like that had like an incredibly, I think that the government spending did a lot more good than it did harm. And I don't really think it contributed that much to inflation.
Okay. So several things to say here. First, I think that what you see is when people are in a field where they have more specified knowledge, that they're actually able to sound convincing about the things that make you ignore the obvious reality of things that are going on. One of the ways that normal people are able to check expertise in certain things is by making comparisons for things that they could see in the real world. So, for example, one of the simplest ways to compare how bad is the inflation right now that we're experiencing is to look at previous cases of inflation and say, how does today's economy and inflation stack up to those previous cases? And so when we say, this was as bad, this is the worst we've seen since the 80s, and then to show, well, if we were using the same metrics, actually this would be worse than even those times in the 80s. That's actually something that's very useful because it allows us to see the people that control our federal policies, whether you want to go to Trump, Biden, people in Congress, people at the Fed Reserve, etc., how poorly of a job they're doing. How much of the blame is on them is something we'll talk about, but certainly we can see that it is poor. And so to say, well, it's just a talking point, it's not. This is something that people do that want to basically, excuse my language here, baffle you with their bullshit, right? They say, don't look that this is the worst we've seen in inflation in decades and decades, even worse than the 80s. That's just a talking point. That's not true. It's not a talking point to the people that can't afford groceries right now. They certainly don't think that it's just a talking point. I'll leave you respond to that, and then we could get into the, did the money printing cause this? So.
Yeah, sure. I'd have to see the metrics that you're referencing. I don't really think that it's, I understand your point, the idea that, how can someone who's less in the know about a particular subject kind of analyze that subject? It's not a bad thought, and it's not bad to necessarily look at comparisons, but it's important to realize when you're seeing a pattern and when you're not, and also to recognize if you've really equipped yourselves with the tools in order to analyze that situation in the first place, right? I think that it's valuable to say, it's valuable to ask the question, right? It's valuable to ask the question of, hey, I heard that this metric changed and that we actually have the highest inflation that we've ever had, right? If inflation was like 15% right now, that's worse inflation than not the hyperinflation, but the stagflation of the 1970s. But obviously it's a much, we're not facing stagflation right now, but in general, that's the kind of statement that you can make based on that, right? However, I think that what's more reasonable is to say, well, hey, like, the slightly deeper look is to say, hey, well, that change actually made a lot of sense for a lot of reasons, and the data is probably adjusted for it in general, although I can't say that for sure because I'm just honestly not sure, plainly. And all that I would say again is just to reiterate the point that I'm not really sure how much we can blame the sort of economic planners of the day for inflation necessarily. In general, I think that there's a good moral case and probably a good empirical case for the lockdowns. And if we assume at the very least that they were acting in good faith when they made that decision, then any sort of extrapolatory or any sort of transitive effects of the lockdowns that we see today in the form of inflation probably cannot rightly be blamed on like Trump and Johnson and the Italian, all these governments that locked down, the Australian government, and rather we can just act as best we can reactively to the situation and try and quell that problem, which I think that the government is doing. So, to me, I'm not sure, whether it's Trump passing a stimulus or locking the economy down or Biden advocating for masks and stuff like that and passing his own stimulus bill. I'm not really sure how much we can blame them necessarily for that versus just try to work with them whilst they try and address the problem as best they can.
No, so I completely disagree. First, I'm surprised. I already got exactly what I wanted out of this debate.
All right.
Which is that someone like me that was so vehemently against the lockdowns, your concession that, yeah, the lockdowns are to the fault. Great. That's exactly what I wanted. I do think that that's majoritarily the fault. I think the printing of money and the printing of things like that, which we'll get to as the second part of it, but the lockdowns were to fault. And so I was right about that. The people that were arguing against the lockdowns were correct about that. We could another day talk about how effective the lockdowns were against the ailment, but that's right. The economic pain people are suffering right now was because of these people. You saying you don't know how much you could blame sort of the people crafting economic policy. I know how much to blame of them, 100%, because the same people crafting economic policy are the people that were crafting policies against the ailment and all of these other political policies. It's not just specifically individuals that aren't involved in that. So the Trump administration, the Biden administration, Congress, etc., they're the same people that are crafting economic policy that are crafting these other sorts of policies. And so when their policies, with the reason that this conversation is so important right now is two things. One, we could have a conversation, which you're probably better equipped to have than me. What can you as an individual do to help yourself going forward in this economy? But that's not really what we're here to do. These types of conversation are politically, what should we be pushing for going forward? And I think the people that embrace lockdowns are 100% to blame for the economic catastrophe we have right now. And certainly Trump shares some of that blame, as does Republicans that embrace lockdowns and things like that. However, it is quite clear that Joe Biden and the Democrats embrace that ideology even more, and they should be punished at the ballot box because they are at fault the most, the ones that were there and crafted these policies, for the economic disaster that is affecting millions of people in this country right now.
Yeah, sure. I guess I get what you're saying. I'm not sure how connected all of those things are. I think that a good sort of comparison case for this would be during PMQs one week, the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, I think he was asked something along the lines of, hey, this thing happened as a result of your government's policies because of, whatever the lockdowns, like whatever it might be. And do you have any regrets with regard to your government policy and its handling of the pandemic? And to which the Johnson government said, actually, we don't have any regrets because we followed the best scientific advice the entire way through. Now, on one hand, this could be a very unsatisfying response because you're basically saying that despite the mistakes that you made, you have no regrets just because, a person's a scientist or a person's a person of authority, you listen to them. But on the other hand, I think the more charitable interpretation of that, and something that I'm a little bit more sympathetic to, and this might be a fundamental difference between us, is that I don't think that science being wrong or economics being wrong in select points in time, even with some potentially, catastrophic consequences, necessarily means that we should be like permanently skeptical, whenever an economist or whenever a medical professional says something or another, or recommends something or another. For instance, we could say that it wasn't literally formaldehyde. Was it formaldehyde? I don't know. The whole thing where the women, the babies were being born with 3 arms and stuff like that because of the FDA screw up. I think it was something like that. We can say that even though the consequences of that were catastrophic, it doesn't necessarily mean that we should throw out the entire lens of analysis that the medical profession uses. And even though we might say that the lockdowns had a pretty catastrophic effect, I'm not sure that, number one, we can prove without a doubt that they were acting in bad faith when they did it. We can't prove without a doubt that it wasn't actually beneficial in terms of saving a lot of lives. And number three, I'm not sure that we can say reasonably that lockdown should never be a part of the toolkit going forward, even based on the effects that they've had today. Obviously, if we have a much deadlier disease, a disease that spreads a lot quicker, like whatever the circumstance may be, I'm not sure lockdown should, necessarily always be off the table because they have economic damage, because they have sort of transitive effects that we're seeing today. I don't know if that's proven even based on the inflation that we see today. I think that the last thing that I'll say is that it's important to realize that although inflation is difficult, and although it makes, certainly people are very, very aware of inflation because they see it every day in terms of the prices that they pay for various goods, I think it's important to note that, we're on the back of a pretty strong economic recovery. And although inflation is right now about 8% when it should be 2%, the government currently is taking all the actions that you'd expect them to take in order to curtail inflation. And in the case of the Biden administration, they seem to even be taking proactive steps, which I think that we can all get on board with. So in general, to summarize, we can criticize the government reasonably. It's just not, I'm not sure it's reasonable, the entire criticism, and it's probably not a good reason to throw out the baby with the bathwater, quote unquote, with regard to any mistakes that the government made in the course of this fairly chaotic pandemic that we're coming out of.
Okay, I real quick, because I do want to move on to the subset of disagreements we have here, but I do disagree on this. I do disagree on this point. I'll say real quick, because I think no one's suggesting throwing out the baby with the bathwater per se. What we're suggesting is that all of the smart marks told us, like, this is going to be worth it. This will be great. And when we look at the data, it wasn't worth it. And so we should judge when experts get things wrong over and over again. We shouldn't say, well, shucks, they were just wrong that one time. But now listen to them, because it was obvious. When you're making a claim and claiming that your expertise invalidates the obvious things that something would happen, and you say, no, you just can't see it because of our expertise, and then the experts are proven wrong, that's probably a good reason to not trust that their expertise is worthwhile.
Well, but really quick, I'm not sure you've proven the idea that nobody thought the economy would be harmed by lockdowns. At least, obviously we all lived through the pandemic, thankfully, right? And so at least when I was living through the pandemic when it started, and when lockdowns were first getting ordered, I literally don't remember even a single instance of someone saying, oh yeah, economically locking down the entire economy isn't going to be a big deal. There won't be, broad effects of this. I think that mostly it was, we need to do this because it's necessary. and the economic effects are what they are. But I'm just, maybe you can point to some examples.
But I just fundamentally disagree.
I don't recall that happening, though.
Okay, I think if people were if people were honest with the American people and said, look, these lockdowns are going to lead to 7.9% year-to-year inflation. It's going to lead to all of these jobs. It's going to lead to gas prices that are hitting this. It's going to lead to an increase in food prices. I think people would have said, no way. We refuse to accept that. If they said that these stimuluses and things like that I think that we did need to have a stimulus because we were actually telling people that wanted to work that they couldn't. So when you devastate them economically, you have to do something through no fault of their own. You have to do something to help. Unfortunately, the vast bulk of the stimulus didn't go to individuals. And and now the part of the debate I would love to get into, I think you want to too, when we have experts that were downplaying, and you could spin it all you want. The reality is they downplayed and barely talked about the terrible economic cost. And when people like me tried to talk about it, they just said, what do you want grandma to die? They said for months and months, inflation's transitory. It's not that big a deal. A little bit of inflation's good, right? They constantly downplayed it. Even the day that Putin invaded, CBS was writing articles saying, oh, that's the reason for inflation because Putin invading. The mainstream media, the establishment, the economists, the Biden administration, all of these politicians repeatedly downplayed how devastating these economic effects would be. They continue to do it. And they did the same thing when it came to printing money. So the same people, and I believe you're endorsing this principle, is if we literally in 2 years basically double the amount of money supply in the United States, I don't think that had much to do with inflation. That is an insane position to take.
Yeah, sure. So a number of things there is that, again, I think that so you keep alluding relatively vaguely to the idea that people were downplaying the economic consequences of these lockdowns. I'm not sure there's all I would need is like a few examples of maybe a news correspondent or a member of the government or maybe international leaders saying, by the way, the lockdowns, yeah, they suck right now, but hey, to be fair, it's not going to be a big deal. The economy will rebound right after this. I remember some economists speculating about a V-shaped recovery, but a lot of that was based on the stimulus that got passed in the first place. Again, I'm not sure the narrative really makes sense when we say the economy locked down and then the government immediately passed $2 trillion worth of stimulus, but at the same time, they were broadly downplaying how bad the economic effects of the lockdowns would be. Now, you blame the government for basically saying, we won't see bad inflation a year and a half after the lockdowns happen. I'm not really sure that's a reasonable prediction for them to be able to justify at the time that they justified it, which is to say that I'm not sure it would be possible to say, hey, these, once in literally the history of our entire government, locking down, the first time that this has ever happened in such a broad scale and in such an internationalized, globalized economy, I'm not sure it's reasonable to say that, well, they didn't predict that inflation a year and a half later would start really popping off, so therefore we should really incredibly harshly criticize them for the lockdowns in the first place. I don't really know if that makes a lot of sense. And if we want to pivot onto the money printing, I would say that at least as far as I am aware, we didn't, I don't think we doubled the amount of money in circulation. We can look at M1 money stock, that's like, basic money, but actually that amount of money changed in correspondence literally to the definition of that metric being changed. That's where I referenced earlier the definitional change. It's not that we don't have more money in the economy, we certainly do, but again, you've got 25% more money, but you've got 30% less velocity of that money. So it seems like while we do have more money, people aren't spending it as much, which reasonably probably wouldn't lead to as much inflation. In theory, if we printed $1 trillion, but then the government buried it underground and put armed guards around this cauldron of money, and nobody was allowed to spend it, that wouldn't cause inflation because it's just buried into the ground. It's not circulating at all, right? So these are the kinds of things that we have to think about when we consider the idea of, did government spending and fiscal and monetary policy cause inflation? I think that that's what's missing from your analysis.
So you'll notice that I didn't use M1 or even M2, right, when I was discussing money supply. So for those who don't know, there's different ways to measure how much money's out there. M1's kind of liquid money. It's like cash.
Well, I have to guess because you just said money, right? So I kind of
I said the Fed balance sheet. That's what I said in my opening statement.
I think right just now what you said was we basically doubled, or I think you said we basically doubled the amount of money in the economy. So I have to kind of guess what.
So if you want to get technical, what I said in my opening, right, which that basically the Fed balance sheet, which is what I use because I see the argument that people were trying to make. Oh, no, M1, the definitions changed. Well, fine. Then let's use M2, which includes M1. We can still see a massive, like close to a quarter increase in the total supply that increased if we just look at the M2 numbers. And the better numbers to use would be the Fed balance sheet in total. And I read the numbers to you. I could read them again. This is in millions, 4.1 million when Biden was sworn in, 8.9 millions. Right? It's in tens of millions, or it's in millions, I guess. So you're talking trillions of dollars. And so we've doubled. Literally, the Fed balance sheet has doubled. Now, you gave some equation. I'll admit to being ignorant to exactly what economists say that equation is. But in part, that equation, one of the things you mentioned was the total dollars in circulation. You just said that you think that the supply chain outweighed because of money velocity and things like that. But if one of the inputs you're putting into that function to determine this equation is how much money's in circulation, or how much, a better term than money would be, how much assets and how much the balance sheet of the Fed is, if we've doubled that balance sheet in 2 years, how would that not have an incredible rate of effect on inflation?
Yeah, so it's not that it wouldn't. I think that what's important to mention here is that the Fed analysis that I mentioned before that found that the fiscal and monetary stimulus did cause some amount of inflation wasn't that it didn't cause any inflation. It's not that it didn't cause upward pressure on prices. Obviously, federal stimulus and monetary stimulus causes upward pressure on prices. Arguably, that's one of the points of federal and especially monetary stimulus, is to cause some amount of inflation. You referenced the idea that the Fed balance sheet expanded. Well, the money that they injected into the economy is included within that M2 metric. So I'm not. So the M2 metric is all encompassing, right? And so what we see in that is exactly what you said, which was that we see about a 25% increase in the amount of money in the economy based on pre-pandemic levels, but at the same time, we see velocity decreasing 30%, right? And so even though they massively increased the amount of money in the economy in a relatively short period of time, people tended to save that money in general, and they also shifted their spending significantly. And so at the same time that you've got all this asset price inflation, you're also getting a lot of issues where people are, because of the lockdowns and because of the effects of, like working from home, just like people's consumer behavior changing significantly, you see a lot of money getting spent on like consumer products, whereas previously it was a little bit more balanced out. So that's where a lot of the supply crunches come in, is like, supply chains had to curtail in response to the lockdowns, consumer behavior shifted. And so now you've got basically a scenario where the economy is trying to, absorb all of those new dynamics. And that's, to me, why you see a lot of the inflation that we have today. I think that's a good narrative. I think that it's encompassing, and I think it's holistic. And in general, that's why I prefer that narrative to the to the narrative of like, oh, money printing during a lockdown caused this inflation. I'm not sure that's entirely accurate.
So you'll concede that this increase in money supply, or increase in the Fed asset or the Fed balance sheet, it has some input on inflation. Just yes or no, right? You would say to have some.
Right,
input.
yeah, but every economic thinker or economist would say that arguably the point of monetary stimulus is to cause some level of inflation. Obviously, it has some amount of effect on inflation.
We can talk about in a second. So, right. So then the question is, so we're admitting that the lockdowns were disastrous, that they had to do with inflation and economic pain.
you say admit, but again, I question that framing. I'm not sure it's ever been a secret that lockdowns would cause some amount of economic calamity.
Right. We'll just fundamentally disagree on what the narrative was coming from people that were in control of sort of sharing all of these stories through the media, the politicians, etc., and what they said what the harms of lockdowns would be, because it was certainly undersold to us. And I love how history's rewritten. No, we were honest. We told you. We see this happen with all sorts of stuff. But I digress.
All I need would be some examples.
Well, show me examples where they were saying, yeah, these lockdowns are going to be devastating. Why don't you show me those examples?
Well, I'm not the one making the claim. You're making the positive claim that people obfuscated and lied about the effects of basically the lockdowns induced by the pandemic. Whereas, so therefore, I'm asking you, I guess show me some examples where that happened. I mean, you might be able to find some people. I mean, it sounds like the last sentence says if it was really such a grand narrative of lockdowns aren't that big a deal, it's not that big a deal, I'm sure that you would probably have several examples to come up with right off the dome, which it's surprising you don't. Maybe after the debate we could maybe there will be some examples. I'd have to see them.
So those examples exist out there. I could spend my time looking for the examples now, right? I'll just say this. I think that it's obvious that I'm right, because I think that if you're right, that the narrative out there was like, yeah, there's going to be economic devastation. It's going to be horrible. I don't think that the American people would have been as willing to go along with them as they were. I don't think. And I can tell you, for politicians that I personally talked to in Pennsylvania at the state level and at the federal level that were endorsing lockdowns, they were telling me 15 days to slow the spread. And, oh, the lockdowns that you're having in Pennsylvania, there'll be some short-term bumps, but it's not going to be that big of a deal whatsoever. And so I leave it to people to decide what they think that narrative was. I think that, and it's not even necessarily that they lied, though some of them did lie. It's that some of them may have just been mistaken. They may have thought that the lockdowns wouldn't have as devastating effects as they had. But nonetheless, I will reserve my point on that then until the future. And I'll just say this. I'll say that you're admitting that there was some amount. You don't really have a reason to look at M2 as opposed to the Fed balance sheet. But even if you did, so we're talking about the difference between, if we use your metric, 25% increase in 2 years of the total money or the total value in the United States, or a 50%. So somewhere in between those two numbers. Well, so you're saying that you're downplaying what effect that would have on inflation. My question to you is this. You gave an equation, right? You gave an equation. Can you just simplistically explain that equation is? So then we could then punch in a 25% increase or a 50% increase and see, using your equation, how much effect that would have on inflation.
Yeah. So to respond to a bit of what you said and then answer the question, is that you're okay. So I don't think you've justified reasonably why we would use that federal asset balance sheet, or the reserve asset balance sheet, as a means by which we would try and determine how much money is in the economy, right? So if money has some component for inflation, using a sub component of money is probably not the best thing. Whereas M2 encompasses what I'm talking about. I mean, you can see the federal balance sheet. I'm looking at it right now. It looks like it went from about 4 trillion to about 9 trillion as it is today. That's about or it went. Yeah, from 4 to 9, that's about $5 trillion right there. But then, if you look at the M2 measure of money in the entire economy, you can see, based on the numbers here, that is basically entirely encompassing of that, monetary stimulus. The argument would just at that point be like, was the monetary stimulus necessary? Was it good, bad, whatever? But in general, I think it's just poor analysis to use, I think, the Federal Reserve balance sheet when you've got M2, which is a more encompassing metric, and probably more so what we mean when we say how much money is in the economy. In terms of like what the components of inflation that I mentioned earlier, yeah. So it's called the quantity theory of money. It's a relatively simple equation. All it is the price level of an economy times the goods and services. That's going to equal the amount of money times the velocity of that money, which is how fast it is transacted. It's kind of a theoretical construct, because obviously it's a little bit difficult to measure like how many goods and services are in the economy. But then those times the price is pretty much the GDP, and then you've got money, whatever you define as money, and then velocity, however you measure velocity, and then you go from there. I think that the way that
what would you say the velocity is down?
Yeah, I believe the velocity of money is down about 30%. I think that the way that they measure that is, I want to say it's literally sampling U.S. dollars in terms of like how many transactions they go through in a given day. But I'd have to look more into the metric to give you a better answer.
Allow me to make my point. I have 2 points to make here, right? The first is, I did find some of the sources that you were talking about, which I could give you in a second, but I'd like to stay on this argument. So your argument is that the people spending money, the velocity that they're spending money, that far outweighs the money. But based on your own equation, you can see that those are actually equal metrics. They're on the same side of the equation. And so you say that you think velocity is down 30%, and you don't want to use the Fed balance sheet. Instead, you want to use M2. I'll concede all of that. I don't know if that's the best way to do it, but let's say I concede both of your positions there. Fine. So you're saying, the 30% downgrade in velocity of money, that's what's really responsible. Yet you concede that the money supply has been down 25 or been up 25%. So that's almost a horse apiece. So wouldn't you say then, well, okay, it's really close. The 25% increase in money would be almost, for example, if the velocity was down equal to that 25%, then we would say both the money supply and the velocity had equal measure to be responsible for inflation. But you're acting like the money supply had almost nothing to do with it. My argument, which I think is more fundamentally true, is the lockdowns, which you're admitting led to this terrible economic situation as well as locking down while at the same time doubling or having this incredible spending and incredible printing of money is what caused inflation to be what it was. It intuitively makes sense. Your dollars will be worth less if far more dollars are being printed. And so I think that it's very problematic based on your own equation, that your own equation seems to suggest, given what we're conceding in the most favorable scenario to you, that imprinting of money would have been horrible for the inflation we're seeing.
Well, I don't think that that's quite how the equation works. I'm not sure if these are like how do I put this? I'm not sure if these are like quite one-to-one metrics like you described, because they're different like nominal values. But let's just say that was true for a second, right? If we had a 30% decrease in the velocity of money, but a 25% increase in the amount of money, if they were actually equal the way that you describe it, we would actually see deflation, not inflation. So clearly, based on even that analysis, we would say that, well, obviously there must be something else causing the huge amount of inflation that we're seeing, and I would say that it's the supply chains and the supply chain disruption.
Why would we see deflation? That doesn't make sense to me.
Well, because if the velocity of money is going down faster than the amount of money that's being created, what you'll see under your analysis is like a net decrease in the amount of money circulating because velocity is decreasing, right? So
no, that doesn't seem to make sense whatsoever. Now, again, this isn't my field of expertise. I don't have a degree in it, but just intuitively, that doesn't make sense. Right? Because if the velocity, basically there's so much dollars out there, and then people, are they willing to spend? Or are they saving? Right? First off, I don't necessarily agree with you. Like, I'm conceding this velocity argument, which I don't know is necessarily true, because one of the arguments we hear was that demand was up a lot, and yet they were unable to spend because of the supply chain. The velocity argument you seem to be making is, no, people elected not to spend. Right? They chose not to spend, and instead they chose to save. I don't know that that's fundamentally true. It seems to disagree with a lot of economists on your side of the ledger and what they say. But even if it was the case in this scenario, we'd see, instead of 25-30, the money supply goes up 25%, but the velocity is down 30%. If the supply went up 25%, but the velocity went down 25% as well, that doesn't seem to make sense that it would cause inflation whatsoever. If that was the case, these two things wouldn't be on the same side of the equation. So I don't understand how. So basically what you're saying is, if the velocity was 5% less or the 5% more, then we would see deflation right now. That's your argument?
No. So velocity went down by 30%. If
Correct.
Velocity increases, you would see, like, in all else equal.
I'm sorry, there's a misunderstanding of what you think I said. Then I'm not saying the velocity increases, right? I'm saying right now, you're saying velocity decrease times printing of money is what causes, on that side of the equation, how we measure inflation. I'm saying, well, if that's true, 30% of the decrease with the velocity of spending and 25% in the increase of money, that's almost equal, right? So that would mean that the increasing money was really bad. So let's just, for the sake of, and the way I could prove that is to show, if we had that same 25% increase in money, but instead of a 30% decrease in velocity, we had a 25% decrease in velocity, we would still see terrible inflation, right?
I guess I'm not sure where you're getting that. So, like, if we had a ton of, how do I put this? If basically dollar for dollar, if like every dollar created had an equal amount of drop in the amount of velocity, the amount of times that money is circulating, I'm not sure why we'd necessarily cause that I'm not sure why we'd necessarily see that to be inflationary.
Well, then if that's true, right? Then given we're conceding for the sake of this argument, we're conceding money supply increased 25% in 2 years, correct?
Yeah, as far as I can see.
Okay, and we're for the sake of argument conceding that the velocity of spending went down 30%, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so if that velocity only went down 25%, we would see zero inflation.
So again, I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just using because you said they're equal, sort of, within that equation, but they're measuring different things, right? So it's hard to say, like, money plus velocity equals 2, but because they're different things. Obviously, I'd have to look into it a little bit more
and that's a fair answer. However, let me say this: I think the burden on proof is on someone who's making such a seemingly outlandish claim that if we literally increase the money supply 25 to 50%, depending on what metrics we look at, that didn't really have much of an effect on inflation. That's counterintuitive to everything we know about fiat-backed currency.
Well, it's not really. Like, I think that if increasing the money supply caused inflation, there's a lot of examples that would, like, almost entirely prove that wrong. For instance, Money in Macro in his video, I think he did a video on the Afghanistan economy. There's a really interesting example that very much disproves this, which shows that the country of Afghanistan, they actually outsource their ability to print money, right? And so even though they outsource their ability to print money, there's not a ton of new money being created in Afghanistan, if at all, especially now with the Taliban taking over. They're still seeing a huge amount of inflation in their economy, right? Why would that be the case if money printing necessarily causes, or like if inflation is when money gets printed, right? There's obviously more dynamics in there at play, and the dynamics are sort of captured by that quantity theory of money that I mentioned earlier. Now, I think yeah, go on, sorry.
I mean, this is exactly what I'm talking about people, that with expertise and jargonistic terms sort of baffling you with their bullshit. Right?
Wait, what jargon did I use? I feel like everything was explained pretty,
I mean, for example,
layman.
you said, well, the reason that what you're saying doesn't intuitively make sense is that there's this equation. And I was like, well, explain the equation. And you gave me the metrics and sort of the variables.
Well, I used the example of
and then
Afghanistan.
when I started to talk about it, you're like, well, I don't really know the equal value of those variables anyways, right? And then you cite a place like Afghanistan. The reality is this. We know that there is something, yes, there are other factors in addition to just the supply of total money and the increase of money that could cause inflation. But certainly it intuitively makes sense with a fiat currency that if you, for example, if from day one to day two, you double the amount of dollars in circulation, that the value of a dollar would be somewhere around half as much. There are some other things that would come into play, but we know that doubling would have a massive impact on inflation. And so if we use the metric you're talking about with M2, that's a 25% increase. That's going to have a massive effect on inflation. Now, inflation right now, if we believe the numbers, are 7.9%. That's just for consumer price index. The producer price index is up 10%, which is probably even more devastating and suggests that the consumer price index is going to go up. We're probably going to see around 10% by the end of this year to year with inflation. But I digress. It doesn't matter if you agree with that point or not. What I'm simply saying is we could see that it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. Money supply went up 25%, so inflation went up 25%. But we could see that money supply went up 25%, and everyone could say, wow, you would guess, if you had to guess, if you had 25% more dollars a year later, that your dollar would be worth less. That's exactly what happened. And people are like, no, but if we use these complex equations and things like that, we could see that actually the printing of money had nothing to do with inflation or very little to do with inflation. I think that that's a bold claim, and I don't think that you have any evidence to suggest it. And I think that people like me, that even though we might not have the expertise and no equations and things like that, accurately predicted that this massive spending would cause this. And I'll say real quick, if you want it, I have a link if you want from 538 that was taken in September 22nd, 2020. They interviewed 32 quantitative macroeconomists about the present and future economy. 74% of the economists said the U.S. would have been in a better economic position if lockdowns were more aggressive.
Yeah, so I guess to respond to the last point first, because it's a bit of a dead issue at this point, I think that the logic of that is probably not the most unclear, which is just to say that if we had aggressively locked down and we depressed the shit out of the pandemic in the first place, we could probably have come out a little bit stronger. I'm not sure that's, I'm not sure that's the most unreasonable.
But can I? And I know I'm throwing a lot on you, so I will appreciate if you leave me to expand. If you don't want me to, I could shut up. But I'll just say this real quick. That shows the danger of the expertise of economists, because they're assuming to also be virologists, right? Because they're like, we assume that lockdowns would have solved the ailment by now in September 22nd, 2020, right? So that goes to prove what I was saying, that economists were saying the lockdowns won't be that bad. Many of them were saying that, and now we have evidence that 74% of these interviewed were like, not only were the lockdowns not that bad, that we should have done them more. We should have done more of them. So I think that it really goes to show what I was saying, that the narrative that was coming out, not just from economists, were people that were wearing multiple hats, assuming that they knew that the lockdowns would be able to contain the ailment, which they were wrong. We could get into that debate later. But certainly they were downplaying what the economic effects of that would be, which is exactly what I was saying.
Well, I don't think that No. So I don't think that economists are pretending they're virologists. I think economists are just listening to the virologists and then being asked their opinion on the effects of the lockdowns on the economy, which I don't think is the most unreasonable thing. After all, if we're talking about locking down the economy and the economic effects of that lockdown, it probably isn't the most unreasonable thing to say.
But let me ask you that. I know this is tangential, but then if we had economists that were informing our politicians, which you would admit, it wasn't just virologists. You want to, if you're a politician, you're probably not an expert in any of these fields. You go to the economist, you go to the viral, right? You're going to you would agree that's how you're trying to craft policy?
Like going to, well, I think that you just mentioned they asked like 100 economists or something. It seems like they got a pretty decent sample.
But if you're Donald Trump or if you're a governor and you're trying to craft ailment policy, right? You're not, theoretically, you wouldn't just be talking to people that specialize in ailment. You would be talking to economists. You'd be talking, right? A bunch of different fields. So what I'm saying is it's a problem. There's a huge problem if you say, okay, I got the doctor's perspectives from the ailment side. Now let me get the economist's perspective from the economic side. And the economists are advising you stronger lockdowns because we believe the virologist that this would actually end the ailment, therefore the economy would be better. And so this is where you could place blame at the feet of the economists because they were wrong, and we could see the economic devastation.
Yeah, I guess I see what you're saying, but ultimately I don't think that it was economists that were broadly recommending lockdowns. At least that's probably not the advice that the government went towards in order to determine whether or not to lock down the economy. It was probably medical experts, which again, like, I referenced the UK example, right? I'm sure it probably wasn't the, you're probably not, dropping, you're not asking for medical advice from your economists, you ask for economic advice. And with regard to the idea of lockdowns and the economic effects, what these economists, I feel like what they're saying, based on what you've told me, is that if we had locked down harder in the beginning and we were able to depress the curve a little bit more, then the economic effects probably wouldn't have been quite as devastating because less people would die, the factors of production wouldn't have been affected as much. And I'm not sure that's the most unreasonable statement in general. In response to what you referenced earlier, the idea that economists use, jargony language and it's a little bit difficult, whereas I have this sort of intuitive model for understanding when inflation happens. All that I would say is that intuition is a good tool, your gut, so to speak, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most accurate most of the time. And it doesn't mean that the lens by which we might analyze the economy from, like an academic perspective or an empirical perspective is necessarily bad or worse based on your gut. Sometimes economists are wrong. In fact, a lot of times economists are wrong. A lot of the time, a lot of experts are wrong. There's a lot of debates, and the scientific process, which is applied to pretty much all academic fields, is a good one because it encourages that style of debate. It's not that we don't have any lessons to learn from lockdowns or anything like that. It's just that I'm not sure that we should use those lessons as a means by which to disregard that entire frame or lens of analysis, right? I've given you what I feel like is a pretty nuanced and measured response to the idea of like, how can you have money printing but not have inflation? For instance, the best example of this outside the Afghanistan example, which is very direct, is Japan. Like, Japan has printed a shitload of money, both in terms of fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus, but they have always, seemingly for the last 25 years, struggled to get their economy to inflate at all, right? And so it's just obviously a lot more complicated than that.
Right.
We can talk about, yeah, sure.
Hang on, guys. Hang on. Just real quick. I'm sorry. Had a super chat pop in for $5 from OG. He says, my question for Econoboi: economics is too complex for grease tube. Why block links? And then he posts a link. I don't know if you got something. Maybe you got some beef with this guy.
No, I don't think I do. I block. I allow links for Reddit, YouTube, Twitch, and maybe like Streamable and Twitter, I think. But I block most links to avoid spam, I guess. So sorry if you got caught up by the Nightbot there in my chat.
Gotcha. Well, it's a good time to interject and just say, make sure that you subscribe to the channel. This is the dumbass call to action that I guess I'm supposed to be doing all the time. You know what I mean? So we're kind of in the mid mark of the debate. So now's a good time to tell everybody who's just hopping on board. If you haven't liked and subscribed and all that shit yet, make sure that you do. Rob, go ahead and pick it back up.
Yeah, so with the Japan example, so there's a bunch of things culturally and politically wise that they do different. So they're intentionally keeping prices from raising. It's something that sort of the corporation and the businesses do there. So they basically never give raises. They basically never increase the price of their products despite what the spending of the government is. So we can see that there are different situations. In general, though, the principle of if all things are equal, if you we look at things often, and this is what I'm talking about jargonistic. It's not just jargon in terms of the language that an economist will use, but it's sort of the specificity and the sort of overly complicating situations that get us away from seeing fundamental principles that we would all understand. So if we look at money in general and we just say, if there are $1 million in circulation in a particular country's economy one year, and then the next year there are $2 million, but the actual value of labor and production and all those things in the country only raised 10%, will the value of the money have decreased substantially? And the answer is yes, because the value that is represented by the money, right, only went up 10%, and yet you've doubled the supply of money. So we would be able to see. The problem is when you overcomplicate and you're like, oh, but Afghanistan this, and these are things that have so many different variables that I know I certainly am not, and I know you're not prepared to talk about what all those different variables will be, such as the same as Japan. Now, you're already admitting that increasing the money supply would have some effect on inflation. My argument is that a 25% increase, in addition to the disastrous lockdowns that we said predictably was going to lead to terrible inflation. The difference that we're having here is you saying, well, yeah, the lockdowns led to inflation, but I don't think the money supply had that much to do with it. I just think you're wrong. And I think that, like, I've presented my case quite well. I'll give you the final statement on this if you want. And then I have other areas that we could move to, or you could choose to move to a different area. But I feel like at this point, we've kind of both made the point that we're going to make. And I'll just say real quick on the 538 thing that I say, the economists were definitely, the economist, politicians, and everyone else was downplaying the economic devastation this would have.
And of course, respond to that if you'd like, Econoboi. But we are kind of beating a dead horse to death 3 times now, and maybe we can move on to some different meat of this.
Yeah, I guess Rob has some stuff he wants to talk about. I guess to respond to this, all that I would say is that I think you're wrong about the Japanese have like this cultural aversion to inflation. The Japanese government is like desperately trying to cause inflation. I'm not sure that Japanese people are necessarily like allergic to spending money when they have it, right? If they've got the fiscal stimulus, if they got the monetary stimulus, obviously that money in theory, based on your assumptions, should circulate, should cause inflation. They're printing a ton of money and they're creating a ton of money and they're doing everything they can actively to cause inflation. And that's kind of, I think, the problem in general with that sort of type of analysis that you're engaging in, right? Is that you say economists are like, they overcomplicate things, but the reality is that the economy is an incredibly complicated thing. And at least based on the model that you describe, where money printing is inflation, or like, just obviously intuitively, by my gut, it's the case that printing this much money during a lockdown would necessarily cause inflation. Well, there's a lot of examples where that's not true. So it's clear that your model is faulty in some way. And whereas I think that my lens of analysis probably makes a little bit more sense in that regard. I think that it's always whenever someone uses the phrase of like you're trying to muddy the waters or you're overcomplicating things, obviously sometimes that can be true, but I think when we're talking about a relatively complex thing such as the economy and the interactions within the economy, I think that it's important to have as granular an analysis as you can, as contextual an analysis as you can. In fact, I think that what you're falling victim to is oversimplification, if anything, because again, I think there's a lot of examples that prove that type of lens of analysis wrong. My final thoughts on it would just be that obviously money printing, all else equal, can cause some amount of inflation, but there's more dynamics to that, and I don't think that it's been proven, certainly beyond a shadow of a doubt, that any sort of, basically the actions of the government in America significantly caused inflation. It's not really necessarily what, it's not what the most credible people are saying necessarily. It's not necessarily something that I'm parroting, and so I'm not sure that that's true. Last thing that I'll say on the lockdowns is that I think that one of the rationales for having really intense and strict and shorter lockdowns, strict lockdowns, is that they can be shorter, right? And so the stricter you have a lockdown in the beginning, probably the shorter they'd have to be if we would imagine that a stricter lockdown would accomplish the goals a little bit quicker. The issue was all this piecemeal strategy that the Americans essentially engaged in, which caused a lot of issues. So, we can make some comparisons like that, but what else do you have on the docket, Rob? Let's do it.
Yeah, we'll end up staying on this forever if we don't.
Well, it's all inflation related. I'm not moving away from inflation, just other things related to it. I'll just say,
pivoting, Rob. Can't believe it.
I'll just say
Rob,
this,
if one were so inclined, how would you go about blaming inflation on BLM and Antifa? I think you can do it. You can tie it in, right?
The people they voted for, right, were responsible for lockdowns and things like that. In addition, the litany of small businesses that they collapsed by burning them to the ground, predominantly in black neighborhoods, certainly didn't help the economy and inflation. So no, but I'll say
he
this:
did Chatter, he did it. I don't want to hear nothing. That was the best $5 you ever fucking spent. Go ahead, Rob.
So again, it's not a question of oversimplification and things like that. If you're making the bold claim, like for example, if I'm in a field and I say, actually drinking water is harmful for you. I'm in the field of, biology. Drinking water is harmful for you. Everyone's like, what? That seems to go against everything we know. And I was like, oh man, well, you're oversimplifying it. Let me explain why. Like, the burden of evidence is on you. You're admitting that it's intuitive that increasing money supply would have some sort of effect.
Well, yeah, but I've given multiple examples that prove you wrong, though.
But you didn't give examples to prove me wrong.
I did. Right? I mentioned Afghanistan and Japan.
First off, are you not conceding that the equation that you favor does say that increasing money supply would lead to inflation?
Well, I mean, I can only repeat myself so many times. I've already said that.
I'm not asking, like, I'm asking a different question. You're conceding that it does have some effect. You just think less effect than the velocity of spending, correct?
So I'm not sure what you mean by less effect. All that I'm saying is that there's more parts to that equation than just money, right? Now, what I've said before, and I'll say...
I've never argued against that. I've never argued against that.
What I've said before and what I'll say again is that more money, all else equal, which is doing a heck of a lot of heavy lifting, would result in inflation. All that I'm saying is that all else is not equal in this case, and it probably requires some more depth of analysis than what you're providing to the audience.
Right, but you haven't given any analysis on why it isn't. All you've done was give an example of other... No, you haven't. Right? You just said that literally said that I think the velocity of spending is more important. That's literally all you said.
Well, I mean, I would say that's a bit...
Real quick. And you cited other countries like Afghanistan and Japan and said, well, if it's true that increasing money caused inflation, those countries would have seen it. I'm not arguing that it's a 1-to-1 ratio and there are other things that are involved, right? But I'm saying that even you admit that the increasing of money supply has some effect. The disagreement we're having is how much effect, right? And so you've said that the velocity of spending is more important. So then the question I have for you is, why not send every American $50,000?
Yeah. So again, I think that's an oversimplification at best or a straw man at worst, right? So the point of the examples that I gave was to, and well, really quick, I suppose the idea that I haven't given a narrative for inflation is just wrong, and I'll repeat it to remind the audience and yourself and Andrew, right? Which is that my narrative of inflation is that obviously the lockdowns happen, which caused a lot of production processes to be curtailed. Now, getting those back online is fairly expensive, and it's happened over the course of the last 1 or 2 years. There's actually a lot of reasons to believe that we would see inflation coming down based on those same metrics, but let's move beyond that for now. And also, people's consumer spending habits have changed a lot, and obviously that might cause a lot of sort of inflation where people weren't expecting it. If you cannot absorb new capacity in in an industry, that's when you end up with inflation, because obviously they're basically not able to keep their shelves filled and their orders met on time, and so they increase prices. I mean, that's just that's basic, right? That's as basic as I can make it. That's the narrative that I'm sticking with, and that I've already mentioned in this debate with regard to the idea of admitting, you've admitted the fact that money causes inflation. Again, saying that I've admitted it sort of implies that I was trying to conceal that in the first place. No, I mean, I don't think anybody would say that money printing doesn't all else equal cause inflation. I mean, it's not about one of those metrics being more or less important than another. It's just that they're dynamic, right? They move and change constantly. And so, we'd have to look at examples like Japan and say, well, hey, like if they've printed all of this money and they've done all of this stimulus, why hasn't there been inflation if we feel like money printing is inflation, right? And if in Afghanistan, right, if we feel like money printing is inflation, why is it that they're experiencing inflation when they can't print money? Right, so all that I'm trying to point out is that the hyper simplified analysis that you're engaging in is not applicable to most circumstances, or at the very least many circumstances. Now, to respond directly to your question of why don't you just give everyone $50,000? Well, part of it is because asset price inflation that I mentioned is caused when you have low velocity of money and a bunch of money printing isn't necessarily a good thing either. There's equality concerns. There's problems that you might have in that regard if people just save a bunch of money or maybe pay off debt or whatever it might be. So there's concerns that you might have with printing $50,000 or such an extraordinary sum of money. But I don't think that's what anyone is necessarily advocating.
No.
For,
let's be clear here, right? So. The numbers you've cited was a 25% increase in money, right, in the past 2 years. That's correct? That's what we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to put it in simpler terms, we did about $5 trillion worth of stimulus, and I think about like $4 or $5 trillion worth of stimulus on you could say monetary stimulus as well.
Okay, so $9 trillion, and you think that had pretty much a negligible effect on inflation, correct?
So that's a tough question.
Very small. It's a pretty simple question.
Yeah, I think it had a marginal effect. I think that the things that had more of an effect was curtailing supply chains, getting them back online, and then consumer spending habits changing significantly.
Okay, so you think there was about a $9 trillion increase in the money supply? That's your argument? That's what you just said there?
Well, I mean, based on
So you're
Yeah,
better
sure.
at math than me. You're an economist. So let me ask you this. There's 350 million roughly people in this country, right?
I think 330 million. Yeah.
Okay, 330 million. $9 trillion. How much is that per person?
I would say like probably 25 grand if I had to guess.
Okay, so then why don't we send that? Because that would only be a $9 trillion increase, which you've already admitted was marginal in inflation. So why not literally tomorrow print $9 trillion, send everyone 25,000, even if some people saved it? Surely, if I had $25,000 more in my pocket tomorrow, the velocity of which I'm spending money is going to increase, which you say is a more important metric. So I would go out and I would spend, everyone got 25, that's 50,000, that's $75,000 for my households that we have. All sorts of things that I would run out and purchase with 75,000. And we wouldn't have to worry about that increase in money supply. In fact, why stop at just 9 trillion? Surely if one 9 trillion had a marginal effect, second 9 trillion would be marginal. So another 9 trillion on that, maybe slightly more than marginal. So why not give everyone 50,000?
Yeah, no, again, I think now what you're falling victim to is an oversimplification of my argument, right? So at the same time that I'm being maybe too complicated and too jargony, now I've somehow been reduced to just give everyone money and it's not a big deal. That's not what I said.
No. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, how does your rationale not lead to that being an honest question?
Yeah. So it's a great question. So I think that in general, what I would respond to is that. Obviously, with my rationale, which is that, hey, it's a very dynamic thing and these things are changing. And so it's very contextual, the analysis that you have to take into consideration. So why wouldn't I just give everyone $25,000 today? Well, it's because the economy is recovering and it's doing pretty well in that regard. There's a lot of moving parts and the economy is also not shut down anymore, right? So there's a lot more reason to expect that if we gave everyone $25,000 today, that we would probably see a lot more inflation, all else equal. I mean, the stimulus that you're talking about mostly expired. Well,
that's clever.
Let me finish real quick.
Okay,
the inflation that's happening today, you would say is mostly on the back of stimulus that mostly expired at the midpoint of last year, right? So why are we seeing all of this, inflation just now, right? I mean, I think that there's a lot of problems there's a lot of holes in your model, so to say, and I think that's really what I'm trying to point out.
The holes are in your model, and you're trying to get out of those holes by doing exactly what I said you would. You're just turning the table saying I'm oversimplifying, but in reality, what you're saying is I don't have an answer, so I'll just say, well, it's more complex than you can imagine.
Well, I just gave you an answer.
It's not. No, you didn't give me an answer. Like, for example, you're saying things at a pace. I can't complain about you talking fast. I talk fast. It's not the speed of what you're saying, but it's how you gloss over things that you're saying that are horribly important to your argument. And
what
so
did I
a
gloss
person
over?
who's not
Tell
really,
me.
well, let me tell you, a person that's not paying attention might think that you sound persuasive on this. So you said, well, if we gave out $9 trillion and gave every American $25,000, I think that we would see that would cause inflation in different ways. You don't explain why. Why would it cause inflation? The only reason, again, you're saying that fundamentally the problem is that the increase in 25% of money in 2 years, right? That had a very marginal effect on inflation. The real problem is people aren't spending money. That's what you said. So no doubt.
Yeah.
So let's look at it. So there are two possibilities of it causing inflation would be one, that printing so much money would actually cause inflation, which you've already said that wouldn't really be the case with just $9 trillion. And second, velocity of spending. There is no doubt under my scenario that velocity of spending would uptick. No doubt. So how do you gloss over by saying, well, it would probably cause inflation? How would it cause inflation?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. So obviously, I think you would recognize that we didn't just give people $25,000, right? So obviously, the stimulus was broken up into many different programs. I think that the direct amount of money we ended up giving people was $3,200, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was $1,200, then $600, then $1,400, I want to say. And so I think that's a lot different than actually an actual sort of robust spending package versus just giving people the money. Now, to answer your question directly, I see what you're saying, where how it might sound like I'm obfuscating. Yeah, if you were to just give people in their hands $25,000, this would all else equal, that word again, that phrase again, is probably going to be a lot more inflationary than some sort of more robust spending package that's more targeted. I mean, the thing about spending is that
the question is why. That's
so I can answer why. If the question is why, I can answer, right. So it's because certain parts of the economy might be operating below capacity and certain parts might be operating above capacity. Like certain parts of the economy might be hotter than others. Like we talk about the macro economy in the form of averages, but obviously it's all made up of these individual components, right? So if we had a stimulus package that was focused on like I don't know, like building roads and bridges or something like that, where we're probably operating a bit below capacity. There's probably room for money to be injected and absorbed in that regard. You probably wouldn't necessarily expect that to be inflationary, especially because it makes the economy a little bit more efficient anyway. You might expect it to actually have a knock-on effect on the economy. So that's the point. I know that in response, you might be able to say like, oh no, see, there you go, doing it again with all your jargon and overcomplicating it. But I mean, the reality is, I feel like what I've just given you is again as granular analysis as I can give in an online live stream debate or anything like that. So and I think that perfectly fits within the rationale of why some things might cause inflation and why some things won't. For instance, the stimulus back in 2008 didn't cause a lot of inflation because the economy was operating significantly below capacity and people weren't spending the money. So.
All right, so I already talked about the 2008 stimulus. So the difference between actual output and projected output, the stimulus was only half of that. The difference between actual output and projected output with just the America Recovery Act was 6 times. So this is massive.
Well, you're instituting more variables, though. I thought it was just money printing.
Well, again, where do you keep getting that? Like you continue to misrepresent what my argument is. I'm
confused. Is it a problem being complicated or is it not? That's kind of what I'm.
Hang on, guys. Rob, pick it up. Ask specifically what you want, and then Econoboi, you can get right back into it, okay? But you guys are talking over each other. I can't understand what's going on. Go ahead, Rob.
All right.
He keeps saying that, like, where once have I suggested that only printing is the only cause of the inflation? I thought I was quite clear that I said at the beginning of this debate, I already got what I wanted, saying that the lockdowns were horribly devastating and led to a lot of the inflation. I also think that the money printing had a big hand in it as well. So you keep alluding to the fact that I'm saying that it's only money printing that led us where we are. I'm not saying that. I'm not at all. And I'll just say this, like, you constantly see people in the economic field do this sort of thing where the goalposts are moving. It was just about, it was all about velocity of spending. And as soon as I give a practical application to say, well, if increasing the money supply by 25% isn't a big deal and we want to increase the velocity of spending, then surely just send people to direct checks. And he's like, no, because some markets are hot and some are cold. And so, building a bridge would be different than giving people money. Right. But they would be spending money and they'd be spending in overwhelmingly those markets that are cooled off right now. That's why the velocity of spending is down. Now, it sounds very impressive, but it's all a clever scheme to justify we don't want the average person having the money. Fuck them. Let them struggle under inflation. Poor and working class people, more and more reliant on the government. But we can't give them the money. We have to give it to our corporate friends. We have to give it to government spending. It's okay for us to print $9 trillion. Well, what happens is we can see the large transfer of wealth that happens every time we do that. If you're going to print money and it's not a big deal and you want people to spend more, give the people the money. But they won't do it because they know the same people will say, well, we can't just print money like that willy-nilly because if we do, it'll have all kinds of inflationary pressures because they're admitting that the massive printing of money like that has all sorts of inflationary and economic pressures. So it's constantly this, just trust us. We know more about this than you. There are hot and cold markets. It's not just about velocity. It's not, sometimes printing money would cause inflation, but this time we assure you it didn't, et cetera, et cetera. It's nonsense. And it's used as a clever scheme to not admit that the policies you endorsed were wrong and that they screwed over poor and working class people.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little confused by your response in general. So I think that to explain the confusion in the first part, right? So you mentioned like, oh, I'm not saying that only money printing is what causes inflation. Well, what I'm basing that off of is when you said, by my gut, by my intuition, if we increase a ton of money during a lockdown, that's going to cause inflation, right? And I think that narrative only makes sense sort of. It's kind of like a broken clock is right twice a day kind of thing, where it happens to be correct that we have inflation now and that we did print a lot of money. But what I'm explaining is that if we look at other countries in the world, not just the United States, not just the United Kingdom, why aren't they experiencing similar levels of inflation, despite the fact that sometimes in the case of Japan, for like almost 2 decades, they've been printing a lot of money and engaging in a lot of money creation, you could say, right? So it's just there's not a good empirical basis. Well, really quick, there's not a good empirical basis for the idea that what do you call it? How do I put this? There's not a good reason to believe that a simpler analysis is better in this case. And I think that based on what you've just said, you actually agree with that. We might just be disagreeing on the complexity of the analysis. Then you kind of try to, call me some sort of elitist or saying, you don't want money to come into normal people's hands or anything like that. I mean, I think that the stimulus has overwhelmingly helped average everyday people. That doesn't mean that, every single dollar of that money directly matriculated to people's pockets, but I think that there are some things that we can probably reasonably agree that, it might not be direct payments to people, but it also probably helps those people a lot transitively, right? So for instance, the unemployment insurance that obviously helped, unemployed people, the PPP loans, which allowed people to stay on the payroll for their companies. That was probably a good thing that helped people more directly. The assistance for state and local governments, right, which allowed those governments not to go bankrupt, and that would probably help, that would probably help them not cut off a ton of city services and state services that people rely on, or invest in more infrastructure projects that people benefit from. And then everything from that point all the way down to the stimulus bill, I don't think it makes any sense to say like, oh well, you're advocating against giving everyone $25,000, therefore this is just justification, yet another justification why the money that we print or the money that we create doesn't go to average everyday people. I think that the stimulus, despite the fact that it was overwhelmingly not direct payments, that doesn't mean that it was overwhelmingly not directly supportive of lower income people. In general, I just don't think that's a fair characterization of my argument.
Right. So the combination of the lockdowns plus the stimulus have been one of the largest transfers of wealth to the poor and working class to the upper class. That's just a fact. It's been one of the largest in such a short period of time.
Well, what metric are you basing that
off of? I'll finish. Secondly, you keep citing countries like Japan and things like that, right? Like what you're doing is citing countries that you can't even remotely begin to give me all the different variables that are different between those countries. Me saying that you can't argue against fundamentally what I'm saying. So you have to try to use other examples where there are complicated variables that even you don't understand to
those damn examples always messing my argument up.
Right. So then how about the Weimar Republic that printed a bunch of money? Why'd they have inflation? See, that proves that printing money causes inflation, right? You'll say, well, wait, there's variables. We're not the Weimar Republic. The way they did it was different. We could both
I would agree that printing money in that case caused inflation, right? All that I'm saying is that's not the only reason inflation happens.
And no one's saying that that's the only reason the inflation
happens. There you go.
But the reality is that you don't have any good argument as to why, if we just then decided to print infinite amounts of money, as long as we were spending them in the right way, that no inflation would occur. You have no way.
I did. I gave you several.
That's fundamentally true, right? You know that it's fundamentally true. I'm admitting that other things could cause inflation, and you could print money, but possibly do other things that would be harmful economically that would keep inflation low, right? There are certain things you could do, but certainly all things equal, if you double your money supply, you've halved the value of your money. We know that, you know that, and you're trying to overcomplicate it to get away from it. Secondly, when I talk about why don't we just print, because the idea would be fine. Then if there's no harm in just printing money, why not print money and just give it to people? And you have this shadow complex, like this shadowy argument. Well, we can't just give money to people. We can't do that. The printing of the money itself's not a bad thing, but if we give it to the people, they would spend it unfruitfully in a way that would harm the economy. So sorry, we can't just give it to the people. And when I kind of show how that's ludicrous, and that's what leads to this transfer of wealth, because the smart marks always say things like, oh, well, we could just print the money, it won't be a problem. We know how to spend it better than the people, that's ridiculous, and it makes people poor. And so then what you do is you say, well, actually, the stimulus did give a lot of money to people. So my question is, why didn't the PPP loans and other things like that cause inflation? That was putting money in the hands of people and small businesses. And wouldn't it be, you start to say things like, well, infrastructure and things like that. Fine, let's tax the $25,000 we send to every American. Wouldn't that lead to more infrastructure in those ways as well?
So I'm confused. Why don't we tax people and therefore that causes more infrastructure to be built? What do you mean?
I mean, you seem to be saying that the reason that we could print the money and only give a very small portion to people, but the rest of it being spent on things like infrastructure and things like that, that didn't cause inflation, right? So my question is, well, fine, if that's the case, if a lot of that money from infrastructure and stuff like that comes from taxes, in fact, let's just simplify this. Let's simplify it even more. Fine, print another $9 trillion, but instead of giving it to the people, just print it and do whatever project you want to today, and then next year print $9 trillion, right? That won't have any inflation whatsoever, right? So, for example,
no, that's not at all what you're falling into inadvertently a straw man again of my argument.
It's not a straw man because reason is, then why would that cause inflation? Let's say that my issue is
because you're probably at that point, you're probably operating at capacity. Like, for instance, like you could probably spend like the Biden infrastructure bill. I don't think reasonably we could say that that's inflationary because it's $1 trillion over, I think, 5 years, $200 billion a year. There's probably $200 billion worth of shit that the United States needs to build in terms of improving its infrastructure and building new infrastructure, right? Now, at that point, you could say, well, why don't we spend $2-3 trillion? And it's like, I don't know, maybe there's a good argument for that. But when you bring it to the absurd, which nobody is advocating for, which is, why don't we spend $10 trillion a year on infrastructure or on whatever? Well, that's where you run into the limiting factor, which is what I talked about, which is the capacity of the economy, right?
Thank you. You've proven my argument. And
that's
exactly
Rob, no, I'm not.
That is proof of the argument that once we start talking about increasing the money supply 25%, that it's clearly going to have an impact on inflation.
No, it's
You're saying
not,
it
Rob,
didn't.
it's
That's
not.
where I got the number 9 trillion.
You recognize that there's a difference between a 25% increase this year versus, yes, every single year we should increase the money supply 25%, right? That's what you're failing to understand in this sort of debate, right?
Fair enough. Then when that argument, fine. So it would take if we did it again right now, it would only be marginal, correct?
No, if we did, trillions of dollars worth of stimulus right now, we would probably see a lot of inflation because the economy is operating at capacity.
Okay. So then you're again.
I've actually really quick. I've actually now remained consistent.
Hang on,
for
Rob.
The third time.
Try to let him finish his point. I know it's kind of a rapid fire area, but I do kind of want to hear the point get finished. Go ahead, Econoboi.
Yeah, unemployment is low and we're operating at our productive capacity for the most part. So obviously now if we printed a lot of money and stimulated the economy in a broad generic way, that would result in a lot of inflation. I feel like your argument is the equivalent of someone saying, hey doctor, you said I should take a Tylenol for my headache. Well, why the fuck can't I take 100 of them? Why can't I take 100 of them every single day? Right? Well, obviously there's probably some amount of nuance there that's valuable. That's all that I'm trying to say this entire time.
Okay, so again, what you're saying here, what I find interesting, like it's interesting that you talked about the labor market and things like that. I find that interesting because one of the things that you cited was as defense for your position was the stimulus in 2008. But as I've already articulated, we could see that a fundamental difference there was unemployment was skyrocketing. However, when the what was it called? The American Reserve Plan was instituted, rates were incredibly low. So according to your own justification, what you just said about unemployment rates are low right now. So if we printed this money, it would cause inflation. Exactly. Right? We printed $2 trillion while the unemployment rates were low. That's the problem. And so what you're agreeing is you're saying, look, yes, there is a percentage that it would be too high. It would be too high of a percentage to print money. Clearly that would cause inflation. But you're magically saying that 25% increase in the entire money supply of the country in 2 years, that doesn't meet that threshold. And I don't think that you have any credible argument why that's not the case whatsoever. Right? And so all of this, but Japan, but this place, but that, but Afghanistan, all of that's irrelevant because you're admitting the fundamental principle that I'm talking about, that there comes a point when you print so much money that it clearly causes inflation, which is exactly what I was talking about. And you're like, well, clearly that's true. Okay, then what's all of this Japan, blah, blah, blah. I'm saying in this instance that raising the amount of money supply 25 or 50%, depending on the metric that we use, clearly had inflationary pressures. And we see that inflation happen. So you're saying, yes, in principle, that's true. But my gut feeling is, even though we see the outcome was, yes, there absolutely is historic levels of inflation, I just don't think that it met that threshold now with the money. And I can't really tell you why, but I just feel that the money didn't have much to do with it. I think that's ridiculous. And when you understand that even which I just got you to admit, that you agree with the principle that at some point when you print too much, it's going to have inflationary pressures, that it's incumbent on you. If we're not talking about a 5% increase or even a 10% increase. We're talking 25 to 50%, depending on the metric you use. That's clearly substantial. And so the burden of proof's on you to prove that that didn't have a substantial effect on inflation in the economy. And you haven't done that.
No, so I have done that. To respond to some of your points, so I mean, we passed the stimulus bill in March where unemployment was 6%, which I think is about almost double what it was before the pandemic. I'm not sure we could say that that's like the lowest unemployment in general, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't have had any stimulus. I mean, I think that there's a lot of analysis that have been done that's seemingly found that the American Rescue Plan was a good thing for the economy. You could say that it had some inflationary pressure. I actually already said that the stimulus bills had some inflationary pressure. That's not something I'm admitting. It's not something I've been trying to hide this entire time. It's not something I've obfuscated throughout this entire debate. It's just that it's relatively marginal in nature. I don't think that we have 8% inflation because of the stimulus, right? Now, however, you say, you just haven't proven that. You haven't rigorously justified that assumption. Whereas, I feel like I have. What you haven't actually responded to at all all is the idea that there's a lot of supply chain disruptions that are happening based on any index or any sort of measure of supply chain disruption that you look at. There has been a lot of problems in the supply chain as a result of consumer spending changing and curtailed production basically coming back online. That's something that you haven't responded throughout this entire debate with. And to be fair, I've let you sort of frame the debate, and it's totally fine. I feel like this is more of a sort of a Q&A style debate anyway. That's perfectly reasonable. But I just don't think it's fair to say that I haven't actually provided any sort of rigorous narrative. You again harp on the idea that you're looking at all these other countries, and those aren't good examples to test my sort of intuitive feeling that when you print $1 trillion, that causes an inflation. And it's like, well, there's actually a lot of examples where that intuitive feeling is wrong. However, if we were having this same debate, but we were both Japanese and having it in Japan, I feel like you would say, well, what the fuck, Econoboi, you're making this entirely too complicated. We're a lot different than the United States. We have to do this, that, and this to get inflation. Inflation is not even a good thing, right? You've actually agreed with me that actually it's a fairly complicated thing, what causes inflation and what doesn't cause inflation, or in fact, what could cause deflation or upward pressure on prices, right? That's all that I've said throughout this entire debate. I've been entirely consistent, and I feel like what you have failed to do is provide any sort of a robust justification for your relatively simplistic model, or this idea that intuitively when you print trillions of dollars, it causes inflation. There's a lot of examples to the contrary, and if we agree that there's a lot of variables that go into it, it sounds like we agree. We just disagree on those variables. At this point, what you'd have to do is somehow try and make the case that the supply chain disruptions, the historic supply chain disruptions that we've seen, isn't actually the main thing causing inflation, which I'm not sure that you can prove that, because that is actually what's causing most of the inflation that we're seeing right now.
Okay, if I could,
you can respond, and then we got to get into closing statements, guys. We got a bunch of Q&A we got to get to, so go ahead, Rob.
Okay, again, for someone who uses the word straw man so many times, Econoboi must not listen very well. So the very first thing I said in my opening statement was the things that Biden isn't to blame for, because he's partially to blame, but so are Republicans and Trump, were spending plus lockdowns. Those two things would have caused huge inflationary pressures. And I understand that when you start to open up the economy and demand is high, but production values are low, that's going to intuitively lead to inflation. That's literally the first thing I said. Econoboi agreed, right? And I said that's actually what I wanted to get most out of this debate, was that the lockdowns are largely responsible for inflation and the economic problem. So the reason we haven't been focusing on it much is because we both agreed on those positions. But to cleverly get out of not being able to prove your position by saying, oh, Rob already agreed with me on the other part of this, but I'll pretend he didn't and say, why hasn't he talked about this, is kind of a nice sleight of hand, but it's not going to work with me. You say that I have to prove that historic supply chain issues haven't been the reason for this. Well, no, not when I'm conceding that those do have a huge part in the inflation. I don't know exact percentages, but I would say a huge part, as would the historic printing of money. But I find it interesting that you say if we have some sort of historic change, then it's incumbent on the other person that's saying that that didn't have an effect to prove otherwise. Only problem is you have it reversed. Who's doing that? I'm admitting that the historic supply chain issue certainly had a lot to do with inflation. You're the one who refuses to admit that the historic printing of money in such a short period of time had much to do with inflation. Instead, and you keep saying I've answered this, but you haven't. You haven't answered it. You just keep saying things like, well, Japan, well, Afghanistan, and velocity and things like that. But these are just jargonistic terms that aren't answering the specifics as why in this particular situation. For example, now you want to talk about things like unemployment rates and things like that. So again, I talked about this specifically. I said one of the differences between the stimulus now versus the Obama stimulus is the unemployment numbers were far less. You said, well, they were 6%. Unemployment was 6%. Okay, given that, what are they today? 3.9%? Is that correct?
3.5%, I think.
Okay, so can you explain me the difference why if we print $9 trillion where there's 6% unemployment, that won't have much to do with inflation. But if we do it when there's 3.5% unemployment, then yes, that would cause inflation. Can you tell me how you came to that conclusion of that threshold?
Yeah, sure. I guess a quick answer before we get into closing statements would just be that it's not that unemployment is the only rationale by which we would see why inflation would happen if we print a lot of money. However, what it is a metric by which we might answer the question, is our economy operating at like full capacity, right? You mentioned capacity as well as I did, and all that I'm saying is that I think that when we have 3.5% unemployment, when we have like real GDP above potential output, things that you mentioned before, these are probably decent indicators that we're operating at capacity, and that's why we might expect a lot more inflation if we engage in a ton of government spending and a ton of like direct economic relief, to people, whereas we might not expect that when the economy's locked down and when unemployment's like 15%, which is what it was when the large part of the stimulus ended up getting passed.
The omnibus bill that just passed, that going to trigger inflation?
No. Wait, you're talking about the budget bill? That's
yeah.
I don't know what. I honestly don't know. I haven't read about it. Maybe you could convince me.
It's
it would.
trillions of dollars, right? And you just gave the example why if we printed like 1.9 trillion now, that would cause inflation. Well, we just had $1 trillion budget that just got passed. So you're admitting that that's bad. Well, that'll cause inflation, correct?
No, not really, because I'd have to know. I'm not, because it could and it couldn't. What I'd have to know is like for what period of time was that $1 trillion passed? Because there might be a scenario where like, oh yeah, the standard federal budget before the pandemic was about $4 trillion, if I'm not mistaken, right? And it's like, okay, well, this $1 trillion is supposed to fund the government for the next 3 months. And it's like, okay, well, that's actually in line with what the government would normally be spending anyway. So I think the case that you'd have to make, and you could very well make this case, I'm just not familiar, is that the amount of spending that the government just approved is like an insane increase in the amount of spending, which, based on Manchin and Sinema in the Senate, I'm not sure that we're spending a lot more money than we used to. But you could frankly be 100% correct. You just have to prove that.
We got to get to these closing statements,
okay,
guys. I'm sorry. I know. It's never fair. It's never fair who you end on. You know what I mean? It just never is. But go ahead, Rob, with your closing statement, and then we'll let Econoboi go afterwards, and then we'll get to the Q&A. Go ahead.
Right. Alrighty. So my interest in this debate, is it 5 to 7 minutes? Is that, or do you want it shorter than that? Whatever. Okay. My interest in this debate was showing politically how the people that were in charge with the disastrous policies that we've seen in the past 2 years have led to the economic crunch that's affecting so many people. Econoboi concedes that right out of the gate, where he says that the lockdowns are largely what's responsible for the inflationary pressures we see. He just disagrees with the second portion of it. So the debate's interesting, but it already proves what's the important thing for the American people, that our leaders are the reason that we're in this economic disaster right now. Econoboi's area of expertise isn't the ailment and whether or not the policy surrounding the ailment actually solved deaths and things like that with the ailment. And I don't think that he has any backing whatsoever to suggest that lockdowns and things like that had significant effect in reducing in substantial ways deaths, contraction, etc. from the ailment. We could see that in specific places such as Sweden, other places that didn't have lockdowns as strong, and yet their numbers when it came to how many people were affected by the ailment weren't any worse off than most of the places that we've seen. Even most people right now, even most virologists and others admit right now, yeah, lockdowns were probably a mistake. For example, Norway, that originally embraced lockdown, said we could have had the same results without lockdowns and things like that. So we should question these people, because it's clear that they don't suffer the consequences. It's the poor people that suffer. And so when people like me were accurately predicting that this was going to have a net negative effect, I was told that I wanted grandma to die, and you can see how that was a disaster. So that's what I wanted out of the debate. I'm not saying Econoboi was that person, but I got exactly what I wanted out of the debate in that round. Now, the second part of it, that massively printing money, I think that it's obvious that we've got to hear that the Biden administration, the massive printing of money, and even under the Trump administration, the massive printing of money was something that was historic, and that it did lead to inflationary pressures. Even Econoboi admits that. He just says that it was marginal. He has no defense for why that's the case whatsoever. He continues to talk about countries that have printed money but haven't seen inflation as the reason that that's the case, but he agrees with it in principle. What happens is sometimes, I don't know, there's an engineer named Dyson. He does vacuum cleaners and stuff. And he talks about this phenomenon that says that when he got into creating vacuum cleaners, people told him that the particular type of suction that he was going to use was impossible because he didn't have any expertise in that field. And because of the expertise, they had a blind spot or they were also biased and things like that they were unable to see a simple truth that he was able to revolutionize that industry because he was an outsider from it. Similarly here, right? Like what you see is obfuscation and things like that. You see this in fields with this constant appeal to we have to default to these experts all the time. They agree with the principle, and then there's there's nothing I could ever say because Econoboi will always say, well, there's infinite variables, so I'll just cite another variable every time that you show that your principle is fundamentally true. So, for example, he cites places like Japan and things like that, but he can't get away from the fundamental truth, which he even admits towards the end of the debate, that if you massively increase the amount of money, there will be inflationary pressures. We even went through an equation where he showed that the reason that he could prove this initially was he said that on that side of the equation, it was the increase in production of money and the decrease in the velocity of spending and things like that. Now, I don't know that he's true in his argument about the decrease in velocity percentage and the numbers of it, because we can see that actually one of the arguments that many economists make for the inflationary pressures is that demand is up, but production is down. But that's different than the idea that people are just saving and things like that Econoboi has told us. Nonetheless, you can see once we got into the specific numbers and said, but wait, if it's 30% here and 25%, if we give the most favorable numbers to Econoboi, surely that would mean that those numbers, a 25 increase in the supply, had some effect. He doesn't really have an answer. He could just say, like, he could talk intelligently on it by saying things like this. Well, actually, we could see with the unemployment rate and things like that and the value that we have in the economy, we could see that, you know, with things like the actual output versus predicted output, that this would be a good time to do that because we're operating at capacity and things like that. But that's really a non-answer. It doesn't answer why a historic increase of 25% increase in the amount of money in the country in 2 years wouldn't make the value of that money less. And I just don't think that he does a good job at all of answering this position. And I think that it's going to get worse, right? Because I think that one of the reasons that we were able to have inflationary pressures, or to be able to print money and have a lax inflationary pressure to what you would otherwise expect, is because the US dollar is the world reserve currency and the petrodollar exists. Due to policies that Democrats are pushing, by the way, I wanted to get into Biden's energy policies also leading to inflation, which is also true. But due to the fact that, you know, all the disastrous policies that the Biden administration and the establishment are making, we see an alliance that may come to break that petrodollar, or at least have a bipolar world where the petrodollar isn't the sole reserve. That means that this ridiculous spending and printing of money will be even worse, because the rest of the world will no longer just have a fundamental faith because the US dollar is the world's reserve currency and the petrodollar. So it will make inflation even worse when we start printing it like this. And lastly, I'll say, I just find it very interesting. Like, it's amazing how people get it. Did you ever see that South Park episode, right? Where, Randy's telling Stan that he has to invest his money at the bank. And so Stan's mad and he's like, I got $100. And he takes it to the bank, and the bank is like, great, got $100. We'll put it in some mutual fund, slide it over to money here in foreign currencies, and it's gone. And Stan's just like, what? He's like, it's gone. I'm sorry, your money didn't do so well. It's gone. That's basically what Econoboi and people like him in these economic fields are doing, right? They'll tell you, oh, $9 trillion, no big deal. It was very necessary. We need it. It didn't have much to do with inflation, trust us. Cool, then if we need to increase people's spending, why don't we print another $9 trillion and give it exclusively to the people? No, we can't do that. Well, why can't we do that? You said the printing of the money wouldn't really cause inflationary pressures. Well, because there's hot and cold markets, and they might spend their money in the hot market instead of the cold. They just wouldn't spend as well as the federal government. The federal government really knew how to spend that money to ensure inflation didn't occur. But inflation did occur. It's terrible. And the people that are paying the price are poor and working class people. So why not send them the money and give them a chance? What's the worst that can happen? At least then, if there is more inflation, oh, well, at least it'll disproportionately affect the rich. At least the poor and working class will have those dollars in their pockets. Nah, we can't do that. Send your money into us. We'll print a bunch of it. We'll send it to other people, and your money's gone. Sorry, you can't afford your rent anymore. Sorry, you can't afford your groceries or gas. But sorry, that's just the way it goes. But trust us printing the money and our policies, it didn't really have anything to do with it. And yes, the economists, you can't blame them. Those that said that we need more aggressive lockdowns. Yeah, I said that no one was really saying that the lockdowns wouldn't have a significant effect on the economy. Actually, they were saying more aggressive lockdowns would have been even better for the economy. But yeah, you just got to trust them. They know what they're talking about. So, you know, just allow these policies to continue. We should have lockdowns again. Econoboi said we could go ahead and print this money as long as we're not sending it to people. Don't send it to people. Don't leave the. And by the way, sending money to people, well, it's being created. That's what's wrong about this and causing inflation in the first place. One of the big reasons. But it's not really sending money to people. It's allowing people to keep their own money. It's amazing to me how big spenders are always making excuses to, we can't leave people spend their own money. We can't leave the money in the pockets of the individual. They don't know how to spend on themselves best. We need the government to print these dollars and spend it how they see. And some of the money will go to the people, some will, and ignore one of the largest transfers of wealth in history, and ignore the fact that poor people, the highest point in history with young people still living with their parents, or at least since the Great Depression and things like that. The economy is a disaster for so many poor and working class people. And this debate all started because Econoboi predicted that that would not be the case with inflation come the end of this year. I'm still giving the prediction that yes, come the end of 2022, inflation will be terrible. But maybe you're right, Econoboi, just like Biden, maybe inflation will go down, because once you start to hit 7.9 and 10% inflation, once we go down to 6.8% inflation, I'm sure Biden and you could take a victory lap that you solved the problem.
Econoboi, you're up.
Alrighty. It's been a good debate, everyone. It's been fun. It's been clean. Kept it above the belt the whole time. I'm glad that we did that. To respond to a little bit of what Rob said and give a little bit of an underview at the very end, that's a debate term. What I would say is, kind of just going from the start to the end, it's interesting that, he talks about lockdowns again, and, Sweden was actually an example of I suppose it still is an example that conservatives use, is that Sweden actually reversed, as far as I'm aware, their soft lockdown policy. And as a result of their sort of soft lockdown policy in the beginning, they actually did have a relative number of infections and deaths compared to their Nordic counterparts. So I'm sure that it's not necessarily true that Sweden's the best example of lockdown skepticism working out for the better necessarily. And to be fair, I'm not sure that Rob referenced what their GDP growth or their unemployment is. I'm not actually sure relatively how their economy is doing in the first place. In general, I think that some of the things that we can talk about that's a little bit more broad in this closing statement is that we seem to agree that it's complicated, what causes inflation. But it seems to me that, Rob he seems to be pinging me every time we talk about new variables, different variables that might contextualize why we might see inflation or another. So it seems that we're both agreeing that it's complicated, but also I'm getting pinged every time I bring up a new variable or try to, add some clarity to this complex sort of painting that we're trying to paint in response to, to the question, what is causing inflation? Now, I think that Rob is he's trying his absolute best to paint me as a guy who thinks that money printing just doesn't cause inflation, right? And that's not really what I've said throughout this debate. In fact, I think I swear in my opening statement I even mentioned that there was an analysis by the Fed, which we didn't really talk about because I don't think Rob would take the experts over at the Federal Reserve too seriously. But there was an analysis from the Fed which showed that obviously the stimulus caused some inflationary pressure. I think I answered that at the very beginning. Throughout this, Rob has tried to frame this as me admitting it or conceding it. These are not secrets, right? I mean, you can look at a video that I made from a year and a half ago or something like that. That stimulus does cause inflation, all else equal. But it's just a matter of if everything else is actually equal, right? So we talk about, why did this money printing do I think not necessarily cause a lot of inflation? I talk about velocity, and he says, why don't we just give everyone $25,000? To which I would say, well, there's actually a lot of reasons why we might expect that would cause inflation today, because as Rob mentioned himself, the reason that we're seeing this inflation, according to him, is because we had a lot more stimulus than we had in real capacity of the economy, because our economy dipped below potential output. That's capacity that's missing. You fill that with stimulus. Rob says, well, we had way too much stimulus compared to how much we're below capacity, to which he then says, why don't we just give everyone $25,000? I say, well, it's because we're actually pretty much at capacity right now. He says, oh my goodness, it's obvious. Econoboi is an elitist. He doesn't want to give people money. He doesn't want to help the poor and working class people. Largest transfer of wealth in a generation. I hope that everyone listening can see the incredible inconsistency in narrative that Rob is engaging in here. And I feel like, not that it's bad faith, but certainly it's not representative of my broader viewpoints. After all, Rob, in the first debate that we had, was the one arguing against a lot of programs and services that have been proven to be empirically effective, welfare programs and things of the like that would actually help lower income people. Now, obviously, you might make the argument, well, Econoboi, why are you advocating for an expansion of welfare programs, but at the same time, you're not advocating for stimulus? Obviously, a stimulus package is different than a long-term welfare program. After all, for instance, when we talk about the Build Back Better bill that Biden originally conceived of, I think that entire bill turned out to be $3.5 trillion. That was what he originally wanted, which was over 10 years. So $350 billion a year is a lot different than what Rob would say, which is that what did we come out to, $8 or $9 trillion worth of stimulus in pretty much the span of 2 years. That's a lot different, and it's a lot lower scale, and it's also a lot better for lower income people, I wasn't the one arguing against those types of programs in our first debate. He was, right? So I just think I think it's really unfair, I think, to try and paint me as someone who, doesn't want to help working class and poor people. It's just a matter of helping them in a way that is most actually effective. And I think that if Rob has his way, frankly, we'd see probably a lot of people who got left behind in the midst of the pandemic. And we'd probably see a lot of flailing right now in terms of, what's happening? Why are we having inflation? We had such a small stimulus package in the first place. What the fuck? It can't possibly be all of these other things, right? I just think that that's a little bit incorrect. Even if the American economy didn't lock down at all, we'd still be facing a lot of those supply shortfalls because everyone else locked down, right? And so I'm just not really sure I'm not really sure that we can blame necessarily the Trump administration for sort of tacitly endorsing lockdowns by allowing states to do it. I'm not sure that we can blame state governments for doing it or local governments from doing it from there. I'm not sure we can blame them for passing $3 trillion worth of stimulus, and I'm not sure we can blame Biden for adopting very similar policies when he took office. I think that in general, one of the fundamental disagreements that I think that I get in with Rob a little bit here, emblematic of this debate, but also our previous one, is just that I think that it is reasonable that in areas where a person is an expert, that you might give them some benefit of the doubt. That doesn't mean that one individual expert is always correct all the time based on everything that they say. After all, I wouldn't exactly take medical advice from Jordan Peterson, despite the fact that he has a PhD or whatever. Obviously, he's an expert sort of clinical psychologist, right? And I wouldn't expect that Rob might not listen to a lot of my economic prescriptions, despite the fact that I'm a relatively decently educated and sort of industry, proven person in the fields of finance and economics. And that's totally fine, right? But I think that what is unreasonable is when we try to disregard broad consensus. I think that this is where we get into anti-scientific thinking and thinking that's ultimately dangerous, right? So I just think that we can say on one hand, yes, some industries and some sort of academic fields have been wrong. Sometimes they've been wrong very catastrophically, but I don't think that's a good justification for being like ultimately skeptical anytime sort of an industry or academic sort of standard comes out. And I think that that's what Rob either inadvertently or advertently falls into far too often. To end my sort of closing statement on inflation, I would just say that I think inflation will, it'll be high for the subsequent months. I would say that it's going to come down at the end of 2022. I'm not sure if it'll be 6 or 8 or 12% or whatever it'll be. I mean, I just think it'll be lower than it is now. I think it'll be a lot closer to expectations than we might expect. I think I'd be surprised if it was 7% by the end of the year. And I think that the last thing Rob mentioned, which was that inflation was already so high, therefore obviously if it goes down, it's just because it was so high beforehand. It's actually a pretty ahistorical look at inflation. And also, it wouldn't necessarily be a good thing to have a deflation of the economy anyway. It's actually really hard to manage economically when that happens. But other than that, it was a good debate. It was a good talking. Let's get into the Q&A. It's going to be some good questions, hopefully.
Fucking tell me what to do.
All right. I'm sorry, Andrew. Kick me out if you want.
Okay, so there was a lot that happened there, but I really only have a couple of questions because I think that they're the only questions that I need, because you guys, when you went back and forth, I feel like you made the same points multiple times to each other. So the first one I have is for Econoboi, which is, you say intuition isn't very good. I don't think that Rob was pointing specifically at intuition, but rather observable truth, right? He's like, well, it's not just my intuitive feeling about this, but I can observe that right now this is very much going on in real time. So if you would concede, and I would concede intuition isn't very good, could you concede that economics isn't very good either?
No, so I guess Rob can correct the record if I completely misinterpreted in that regard, but my interpretation wasn't that he was saying like observably we can see inflation as a result of this like high amount of money printing. Maybe that would be ultimately be what he said, but I believe at the time, because we didn't have inflation at the time that we printed all this money and we engaged in all this stimulus, right? So what Rob was saying was, no, intuitively, it just makes sense that if you spend a lot of money at a time when the economy's locked down, of course you'll see inflation. And that's kind of that's the narrative that I'm pushing back in terms of, would I concede that economics isn't very good? No, not generally. I mean, I would concede that economics is wrong sometimes, and like academic consensus in economics and in any field isn't always correct. But it's just a matter of like, we should learn from those experiences instead of like trying to be ultimately skeptical anytime there's sort of academic consensus in a fairly well-established field.
Okay, so if real quick, I'll respond to this, right? The idea, intuitively, maybe a clunky word. Like, so let me say this. Let's say you were to tell me, jump off that 500-foot bridge into that water. And I would say, wow, logic or intuition or whatever, based on observable things I've seen in the past of what happens when people jump from high areas, lead me to believe that that would harm me or potentially kill me. And you would say, no, I can give you a bunch of reasons why that's not right. And so then I jump and I die and get hurt. And you're like, well, it was always a possibility, et cetera, right? What I'm saying is it seemed to make sense based on what we know from economics and the idea of how money works and how economies work. If you tell a bunch of people you can't go to work, and then you raise the amount of money in that system, that the value of that money and economic pressures will be harmful. And you're like, well, no, we can't say that. Well, that's regardless if you say that my intuition, that to look at it through intuition and instead look at the experts. Well, I was right. My intuition was correct. And the other thing is this, right? Like, it's just, I don't know how to explain this. Like, there are all sorts of principles that we look at that maybe aren't observable in the immediate reaction. And there's certain fields that we can't really tell. Like, so there are certain fields of science. If we were talking about sending a ship into outer space, like thousands of light years away, you won't be able to observe it immediately. And yes, we're able to make predictions of what would happen once it gets to certain areas. So again, the principle that I was discussing, which you end up conceding, is if I have 100 gold pieces for my town or my country, and I have $100 and each dollar represents a gold piece, and the next day I print 100 more dollars, the value of that dollar is basically cut in half. Now, it's more complicated when we have a fiat currency, but if you double your money supply, it's going to have a net effect on the value of the money. That principle is true. There are variables. There is a lag when people realize, oh, I didn't realize that there are twice the amount of dollars, things like that. It might not be a 1-to-1. Now it's exactly half as much because there's so many variables. But that is a truth that we understand through intuition or through observable facts, etc. You saying, well, no, that doesn't work in this case, even though you acknowledge that principle is generally true, is what puts the burden of proof as to why in a 2-year, again, this is a massive increase, 25%. You say $1.9 trillion bill. That's one bill we were talking about. Yet you concede through your own numbers, which we've used the whole time, that are the most charitable to you, a $9 trillion or 25% increase in 2 years. So it's not just the 1.9 trillion or the 3 trillion stimulant. No, it was 9 trillion. This is a huge number. And anyone that remotely has any idea of how economies work will be like, holy shit, 25% more money in a 2-year span. That's going to devalue the money, right? And for you to say, no, not really. It won't really have much effect. Seems like an incredible statement that would require incredible proof, which I don't think.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is a huge number is a good way to summarize your argument.
Right. And I understand that's a glib response. But again, then when I start talking about other huge numbers, you say, no, those numbers are too huge. That's what you say. Those numbers are too huge. Right. So it's easy to be glib. And again, I understand the nature. I understand like the want to be glib about this, because when you're trying to explain to poor people why they should accept this inflation and why they should accept the fact that they can't pay gas, but money shouldn't go to their hands if we're printing it. Instead, we can print trillions of dollars and the government knows what to do with the oops, and it's gone. Sorry, you can't pay for gas. I understand why you'd want to have a glib response where people
I don't know when I said the numbers are too huge,
that you've advocated for have fucked people over so bad. So I can understand why you would want to be glib.
I guess I'm glad you can understand. I just don't know when I said the numbers were too huge. Sounds like what you actually said.
We can't do 9 trillion year after year. You have to understand that's too big.
Oh, well, yeah, I guess so. I didn't quite use that phrasing. Maybe you're right. I feel like you understand what I said, though, in that regard, which is that it's nuanced, it turns out. I just don't think it's fair to say that your nuance is what's fucking over lower income people. Again, I'm not the one that argued against good programs that would actually help lower income people. You were. And I don't think in general.
And again, if you're going to, so I could respond to that since it's not just your closing statement. What had happened was this. Like, I advocate for leaving people keep more of their own money because I think the individuals spend their own money better than the government could spend it on them. But if the government's going to force you to not be able to work, and then they're going to print $9 trillion and spend it as they see fit, I see no reason if we're told, oh no, it wasn't really a bad thing for inflation that we printed that $9 trillion, then print it and give it to the people, right? That's my claim. If you're going to say, no, we could just print $9 trillion in 2 years, 25% increase in the money supply, and it doesn't really have that big of effect on inflation, then I say, fine, if that's the tact you're taking, then give it to the people. This is a completely different argument to whether or not I think, like you did, that we should take 2 million illegal immigrants a year.
What you said at the beginning.
Or things like, or we should, give free Medicare to illegal immigrants and shit like that you're saying is good for them. It's a completely different argument. And what we can see is the fundamental difference between someone who's more socialist like you and me is I think that people should do things based on their own applications better. You want massive government programs, and whatever you say, the programs that you suggested, you wanted lockdowns, correct?
I'm answering questions. Yeah. So I think lockdowns are probably better than they were bad.
And you wanted the $9 trillion increase in printing money, right? 25% increase. You wanted that, right?
Well, half of that is monetary stimulus, which I think the debate's a little bit more out on. I would say that the fiscal stimulus is perfectly defensible, though.
Okay, so the economics, just know this, that the guy that doesn't claim to be an economics expert or have a degree and be respected in the field told you that you would be fucked economically if you're poor, working class, and Econoboi's policies were issued. But the economic expert says it's all worth it. That's all you need to know. And by the way, we could print $9 trillion again under certain circumstances, but we can't give it to you. We can't give it to you. It's all for you. It's free, but we can't send it to you. The government will spend that money better. That's the end of this. Yeah. The policies that you advocated for led us to the terrible economy we see today. End of story.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last thing that I'll say is just this, very short, which is that what you said in the very beginning was that the reason we're seeing so much inflation is because the stimulus outpaced the glut in output relative to potential output. That is your logic for why we're seeing a lot of the inflation. Sure. However, you asked me the question, why don't we just give everyone $25,000? And I say, well, because we're actually operating either at or above potential output, that would probably be very inflationary. And you're rejecting that logic. You're rejecting your own logic, Rob. I don't know how you don't see that. That just seems really weird. No, the difference
was, but then if you're accepting the logic, we said that inflation would occur if, again, because you're the one who cited the Obama stimulus as a reason that it didn't cause inflation. But the difference was, one, the unemployment, which you talked about, the unemployment numbers. But secondly, that stimulus was only half of the difference between actual output and potential output. The Biden stimulus is 6 times greater than the difference between actual output and potential output. So if you're conceding that argument, you concede that this clearly had a huge effect on inflation because it is massively different than any other stimulus or printing of money that we've ever seen in the history of the country in that effect.
And yet you're the one that agreed with me when I said this is an extraordinary circumstance. Obviously, there's some different assumptions that you could input into the scenario, right? So, I'm the one arguing for a more granular analysis, and you're arguing for a more simplistic one. And I just don't think that in this case it's appropriate.
But again, you keep saying that. You keep saying more granular, but you always just say that even when we break it down, like with your, the equation that you said, you're like, wait, there's more variables that come. And again, you're very clever in the way that you just slide by certain things. So for this example, you say that this is an extraordinary situation. Of course, it is an extraordinary situation. And actual output and potential output, the metrics that we're using, take into account that this is an extraordinary situation. Yet despite that, just because the variables that we put in came about because of an extraordinary situation doesn't mean that the principles of economics no longer apply. So if it's bad to have a 6 times greater injection into the economy of money than the difference between actual and potential output, it's bad in all scenarios. You don't say, well, the reason that difference in potential and actual output are different is because lockdowns and the ailment and things like that. Okay, but it's still, those variables are what those variables are, and you just gloss over that. You just slide over it. You're like, oh, well, it's an extraordinary situation, so this time it was okay. It was okay this time. It's extraordinary.
All right, guys, we're gonna move to the next question.
Let's
here.
do it.
All right, Rob, you said it wasn't the speed of what he was saying that was problematic when he said that you were oversimplifying this. And you kind of said, it's because I talk fast and this type of thing. And would you say that was the wrong word? Did you mean maybe velocity? It was the velocity.
The velocity of speaking. Right. What I was trying to say is literally you asked that question so prudently here at this moment, because literally what he just did is what I'm talking about. right? He will say, it's not that he's literally talking fast. It's that you gloss over something, right? And so he glosses over. He's like, well, the difference between potential and actual output, the reason that this time that it's okay to go from half of that to 6 times that is because we're in extraordinary circumstances. But that's it. It sounds, if you're listening, it's like, oh, reasonable. But wait a minute. That is an incredible statement that requires an incredible amount of explanation. And he constantly just glosses over it. So he'll say a lot of things that's like, oh, these are good points. But when you get to the central point that's needed for his argument, he just quickly glosses over it as if it's an accepted truth. And this is a clever tactic. If you are someone, like, picture that you're a mechanic, right? Like, you could be like, someone's like, really? This is going to cost $4,000. And they're like, well, ultimately what you're going to need is a new alternator, and there's many problems that occur with these cars. Like, they've had problems with alternators in the past. And, it's very problematic if you don't have one, because it could leave you stranded on the road. Normally they cost $250, but sometimes it changes. So that's why it's very important that you pay $4,000 right now. Sounds persuasive, but it's like, whoa. What did you say? Normally it costs $250? You seem to gloss over that real fast. Why is this situation unique? Well, it's because each situation could be unique and there's different variables and things. Like, they'll always be able to baffle you with this bullshit. Well, this is an extraordinary circumstance. So that's what explains taking away the principles of economics that we've dealt by for so long. But trust me, I'm an expert.
You can respond to that if you want, Econoboi.
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, I've never claimed to be an expert in economics. I really haven't. And the reason I haven't isn't because I maybe would never be considered an expert. I just don't think I'm an expert, right? I think I'm someone who is reasonably educated in the field, worked in the field and stuff like that, of like finance and economics. But I wouldn't call myself an expert, because expert has a lot of attachments to it in general. And we're talking about something that's probably outside of like what I might call my area of expertise within like finance and economics. But in general, I just don't think that's a fair characterization. To give a shorter answer, all that I would say is that it seems like whenever I try to give a more granular analysis, Rob's response is, well, there you go again, trying to obfuscate or obviate or whatever. And I just don't think that that's really necessarily true. I think that in general, what I've tried to do throughout this debate and throughout the sort of my existence in the online politics space is try to engage in as granular analysis as possible, to give people as much nuance as possible, and to equip them with the tools that they need in order to come to some reasonable decision themselves, right? And I think that at the end of the day, if people listen to me and they find that what I'm saying is persuasive and sounds reasonable, I mean, it sounds like I've done my job to some extent. I'm not some propagandist. I'm just trying to explain to people, my view on the economy and go from there. And to any extent that you feel like I have tried to pivot away or not answer the question, I think you're wrong. I think I've answered all your questions directly. And I feel like in any scenario where I come up with a different metric, it's because you asked a different question, right? And so that's obviously why you might engage in a bit of a different analysis, because these things aren't all they're not all one-to-one. One economic rule doesn't apply in every single circumstance. That might sound frustrating, but that's the reality of pretty much any field. And I think that that's a reasonable way to go about your analysis of really anything, economics or otherwise.
Well, so let me move on to some of these other questions where we won't be able to get to them all. This one was from the Super Chatter OG. He ended up DMing it to me because it's a little bit of a longer question. He says Econoboi claims to be an economist. I don't know if that's
I don't make that
claim
claim, actually.
Right.
You said you're well respected. You're not.
Right.
You didn't say expert. You said you're well respected in the field. Is what you said.
Well, I don't know if I said that necessarily. I mean, what I can say is that I've done a lot of work in the field.
Well, you did say that. You did say you were well respected in the field. You did say you were well respected.
Yeah, I've done respectable work in the field. Sure, let's say that. But I don't claim to be an expert, and I don't claim to be an economist. Economist is a profession, and I don't work as an economist.
Okay, gotcha. He says, but he entirely ignores the basics of supply and demand. We increased the demand while shutting business down, encouraged looting and crime, sanctioned our supplies, mandates that closed shipping, protests that closed trucking, imported thousands of demand-based migrants, and yet Eboi thinks none of our actions lead to increased inflation. Eboi clearly has not analyzed the implementation of the Main Street Lending Program nor the Paycheck Protection Program. How are we not experiencing demand pull inflation? But more importantly, how haven't our actions to respond to the pandemic not led to it.
Yeah, sure. I would say that obviously demand's increased to some extent. It's really just a matter of like, do you think demand's increased commensurate with supply or not, right? And do you think supply has decreased at all, right? All that I would say is that, obviously to some extent, giving people money directly in their bank accounts does increase demand. But then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, on one hand, the economy shut down, right? So they're not able to buy a lot of the stuff that they might normally be able to buy, or they might not be able to get it as quick as they'd normally be able to get it. So that's one thing. And then on the other hand, a lot of people have a lot less money because they're on, unemployment, right? There was a lot of people that got laid off. Sure, the unemployment was boosted, but for as many people who might say like, oh, there was people that made way more on unemployment, there was also a lot of people that made way less, right? And it at least based on what I was able to find, it's not clear that that actually led to a lot more or less unemployment. It's not clear that that led to a lot more or less demand necessarily. That's part of the point of fiscal stimulus, is that demand goes down in a recession, so you fill that gap. That's sort of the basic Keynesian idea of the business cycle. And so all that I would say in response to that is that I think that what you're undercutting in your analysis is similar to what Rob didn't necessarily undercut, because we didn't really get to it as an in-depth way. But I think what a lot of conservatives undercut is that we had a big supply shift in the economy because there was a lot of curtailments and there was a lot of change in consumer spending, which caused a lot of congestion in our supply chains. Not to mention the fact that obviously everyone's getting this, deadly disease, which is causing a lot of, for instance, if you talk to anyone who works in logistics, one of the things that I've been hearing is that a lot of workers are just sick, right? And so that causes a lot of disruptions. When you've got like 20% of a crew on a shipping dock that are sick and have to quarantine, that causes probably a lot of problems in the supply chain. So in general, supply shifts downwards a lot more, in my opinion, than demand shifts upwards. And that's what I think is missing in your analysis. But I have, in my mind, taken that into account.
Can I just ask real quick?
You can,
Okay.
but I just want to say too to chat that I timed out Truth and Tradition for looking at me cross-eyed for 5 minutes, and that's what he gets. Go ahead, Rob.
Good. Thank goodness. A moderator that cares, finally.
Can't believe it.
What I don't understand by your analysis is, right, you didn't even really discuss supply and demand, which we should have got more into. Instead, you were talking about something that seems counterintuitive, which was velocity of spending, right? And I've mentioned this several times, that most economists that I'm reading, even if we say we should trust the consensus in the field, which I would love to debate you on sometime, because I think that that's one of the worst things, that we certainly expertise, right, has some effect, and who you are as a person has some effect, but we now just default to trust the experts, and it allows all sorts of heinous shit to occur. So I'm glad that there are laymen out there holding experts' feet to the fire and not blindly trusting them. Nonetheless, the question I specifically have is, all these experts seem to be suggesting, well, what happened? The reason that this started right under Biden was the economy started to open up. So now the velocity of spending was much higher. All these people were spending, but the supply of goods, so the demand went way up, but the supply was down. But you seem to be suggesting the opposite, that they opened up the economy and people said, no, we're going to hold on to our money. We're not going to spend.
No, so part of what I said, I hope was clear enough, which was that not that everyone's just holding on to their money. A lot of people are saving, and a lot of that money did end up going into asset prices. That's why you're seeing a lot of asset price inflation, which is like way more than actual sort of, what we might call regular inflation. So, that obviously, I took that into account as much as I could. I think that what I said to explain some of that was that, at least on the reading that I've been able to do, is that consumer preferences have actually shifted significantly. And so that's what's causing, they might be spending overall, or like, the velocity money might be coming down, but where that money is getting spent is changing significantly, which is causing these sort of supply chain disruptions in general.
So it's not velocity then?
No, it's Rob, I swear. So it obviously, velocity has an effect. This is what you just said. That's a perfect example of part of my frustration in this debate, which is that you ask a different question, right? It's like, okay, well, you talk about velocity, but what about this thing? I talk about this thing, but then you say, well, it's not about velocity then. It's like, no. There's a big picture that we're painting here. They all have an effect. They all have different effects. It all depends on the time.
Agreeing, but this is why I mentioned that right here, right?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
I'm glad that you said this, and let me explain why, right? Because we're all agreeing that there are many pressures that are doing this, right? All of us agreed with that. And for right out of the debate, we agreed that supply issues largely caused by lockdowns to the ailment was a big reason for that. We both agreed with that, right? Right. So then we're asking this question specifically about money supply. We're asking about it. And you said that you thought the single biggest factor was the velocity. the velocity of the spending. And so then when I say, well, that seems a little bit,
Well, I don't know if I said that's the single biggest factor, though.
Well,
I mean,
you said that you thought that was the biggest factor. Am I wrong about that? You didn't.
I don't know if I don't know if I said it's the biggest factor, but my explanation for like your response of like, hey, why are we printing all this money? But like somehow under your worldview, Econoboi, that's not causing a ton of inflation. And my response is, well, the velocity of money changed. Now, at the same time, we have to explain that's the first part of the question. The second part is, well, why are we seeing inflation though? If it's not because of the money, that's when I start talking about the supply disruptions, all the problems in thereof, the changing consumer spending. That answers the second part of the question and helps paint that picture. It all flows cohesively, but it seems like you're getting caught up on these, individual parts, which I just don't think is reasonable.
Because the problem is, right, when we both agree that the supply chain is a big part of it, right? So now we're quibbling on how much of an effect did the increase in money supply cause? And you're saying, well, I'm not the one who brought this up. I couldn't have told you before we started here what the equation was, how, the economic principle of how we think we get to inflation. I couldn't have told you that. You brought it up. So I'm taking you at your word that I might talk to an economist tomorrow and be like, what the fuck is that guy talking about with that equation? That's horseshit. But I'm taking you for your word because you're someone who studied in the field. So I take you at your word and I'm like, so you're saying on this side of the ledger that equal equation would be the money supply times the velocity of the spending of that money. And you're saying because those two factors are there, you think that the velocity is far more important than the money supply. And so then as soon as we hamper down, I'm like, but wait a minute, that velocity argument seems to be kind of counter to what a lot of people are saying, that actually people are trying to spend more. And then you're like, well, they're spending more on different things. But then that velocity argument you made is sort of the principal driver, other than the lockdowns, which we both agreed is a huge driver, seems to be suspect at that point. And it's not just that this is another thing. It's something that seems to be completely counter to what the experts are saying. They seem to be suggesting that people are spending more. And so I do accept your part of the answer that says, well, some people are saving. Fair enough. That's a direct response. But saying, yeah, but they're spending on different things. Well, that doesn't really answer then why you suggested velocity was a crucial factor far more than the money.
Yeah. Well, because on one side of the ledger, like you said, is money and then velocity. But then on the other side, you've got prices and then goods and services, right? And if you've got constrictions in prices of goods and services, what you have is an amount of money that's chasing fewer goods because of constrictions in that, the supply chain, basically, right? And so that's when you end up with higher inflation. And so again, I just don't think that the money side of the equation is more relevant in this case than the actual amounts of goods and services, the supply side, right? That's, I've been really consistent the entire time.
But again, when we're talking about that specific side of the equation, you're saying that clearly that side, any equation, both sides of the equation matter, right? Almost to an equal, in fact, by definition, to an equal effect at some point, right? So when you say, well, the two factors on that side, right, are velocity and money, and I think the velocity is much better. And now when pinned down on it, you're like, well, I don't really, okay, you're right. The experts are saying the velocity is actually increasing and not decreasing. But I still don't think that's important as this other thing. That would seem to suggest that money, because that side of the equation is still important. So the less that velocity is changed in the way that you're talking about, the more importance that the supply of money would intuitively take into account.
No, because if you rearrange that equation algebraically, you end up with prices equaling money times velocity divided by the amount of goods and services, right? And so that's like the equation for prices. And if you end up with a case where you've got velocity of money decreasing while at the same time you're printing a lot of money, you can see that the top part of that equation might actually remain relatively static, but you still end up with a lot of inflation. Why? It's because the bottom part of that equation is becoming smaller. And so prices raise as a result of that. So it all works cohesively as a narrative. I just think that
it doesn't. It does, and let me explain why. Because
it does, Rob, I promise.
No, it doesn't. And let me explain why it's true. Because then what you're saying is this: like, if the velocity was increasing and the printing was increasing, right? Then that side of the equation would be bigger, and that'd be more problematic, right? That's what you're saying. Or would that be more impactful? Let's not use the word problematic.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're talking about. If we've got a scenario where the economy is at full output and velocity is, relatively constant or increasing, and you print a lot of money, put it into the economy, that's where you'd probably say, hey, this money printing did cause the inflation because people are taking that money and they're spending it.
Okay, so hear me out then. So you're saying, velocity times money, right? But if the velocity number is negative, then it's like we're basically moving it to the other side of the equation, right? That's what you're saying. So what that would seem to suggest is that if that side,
the other side of the equation.
Well, I'm articulating that poorly, right? Like, let me just finish what I was going to say.
I'm sorry.
What that seems to suggest then is that the money's even more important. right? Because you're saying, if we increase the money supply 25%, but it's basically being offset because velocity is down so much, right? If that velocity was just static, then we would say, oh yeah, look, that side of the equation is higher because we increased this money print.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
No.
then
And,
real
and Rob,
quick,
to be fair, but I can answer your question
Let me
directly.
finish real quick. I promise.
Yeah.
Like, I'll be 20 seconds. Right. Well, then what that seems to suggest is that inflation would not be as bad if we're not printing the money. The only thing that's making it seem as if the printing of the money isn't that bad is because the velocity of spending, which now you seem to be backtracking a little on the velocity of spending, that the velocity of spending is down. Right. But then that shows that it would be even worse if the velocity of spending was up. But certainly then the money printing does have a substantial effect. It's just being masked because velocity is down. And yet, because of this other thing, because of supply chain issues on the other side of the equation, we still see inflation.
Make the sky a little more blue.
Yeah, so
define
again,
and refine
I think that my response to that was
and
that,
add a little pop of color.
I'm never
Do
at any
quick
point
actions in Lightroom.
downplaying
Instantly give
the
you
role that money
suggestions tailored to your
has
photo,
in that
so you can
equation.
get
Right?
the look
Obviously,
you
money
want.
is a perpetual
Don't
part of
forget to add
that.
the Lightroom
It's just a
app to your
matter
phone
of
and try
how
quick
can we
actions today.
explain inflation happening when there's a lot of money being printed? How can we explain inflation happening when there's no money being printed? And how can we explain inflation not happening when there's a lot of money being printed, right? And my analysis actually is able to answer all three of those questions, whereas I feel like yours isn't necessarily able to do that, right? Money is an important part of the equation. It's just that in this particular scenario, and at least based on what I've been able to read, the much more important part of that equation in terms of like, why are we seeing the inflation that we're seeing? Not that one is less important or the other, maybe that's poor phrasing. It's just that the actual explainer for why we're seeing that inflation is the actual amount, this basically the supply chain that's happening, the supply chain problems that are happening in the economy. That's all.
Fuck, let me just say, and again, this is what I mean. Like, again, this is all to go against the obvious principle that if you massively increase the amount of dollars that exist, you devalue the dollars.
We're never going to get past it, Rob.
I know, I'm not trying to I'm just saying, so I'm trying to get into this equation principle. Both sides of the equation would be equally important, right? You would agree to that.
But they don't move in the same direction. That's why they can't always equally be able to explain why we see inflation or don't.
But both sides are equally important to the idea of inflation, to what inflation is. It's just you're saying that the side of supply chain issues is so much more out of whack that's what's explaining. What I'm saying, though, is the idea that we would say there are equal importance when it comes to inflation on price times velocity of spending versus supply chain issues and production issues, right? Those are equally important.
I'm honestly confused by the question. I don't know what you mean.
It doesn't, I don't think it matters if you answer to it now or you don't answer to it now. Because it's become somewhat circular at this point, right? The back and forth,
archaic, right? That's fine. Yeah. We could move it. I'm just saying that side of the equation clearly matters. And when you say that actually
it does, I agree.
Negative, right? And when you're saying that there are negative balances on that side of the equation, then that shows that the money at that point is even more important.
I'm struggling to understand that logic, but I will have to move past it because okay, that's fine. I'm not trying to be a dick or anything. I just genuinely can't really understand how you're getting that. But let's are there any more questions, Andrew? I'm sure there might be. A few more.
Yeah. I mean, there still were quite a few. Obviously, super chats always get priority.
Let's do it.
But we're almost 2.5 hours in.
Oh no.
So I'm actually gonna wrap it up because otherwise I think what's gonna happen is you guys are gonna start knocking each other around at the next question and we won't be able to get anywhere. So
stifling free speech once again. Can't believe it. The Crucible.
Trademark. What is it? Is it Big Papa free speech? You know, what the fuck? What the fuck do you think this is? Rob Noerr, shout your channel out. Tell everybody where they can find you.
Most of the time on twitch.tv/Rob Noerr, all one word, all lowercase, usually streaming most weeknights around 8 p.m. Eastern. Also have a YouTube channel and Odyssey, Normal America with Rob Noerr. So you can find me at any of those platforms. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And then Econoboi.
Been a good debate, Rob. Always fun talking. I remember I asked a Twitter question the other day, and the question was, could you be close personal friends with a Trump-style conservative? My answer to that is yes, I could. And so I don't really take any of this kind of stuff personally. It's always fun talking. In terms of a shout out, if anyone's interested in learning something for once in your life, that's how I always end these. Go to Econoboi on YouTube or Twitch and watch all my live streams, watch all my videos. If you want to see me actually debating Rob, we debated once already on my channel. It's one of the most viewed videos I did. People really liked it. It's called Debating Rob Noerr on Economics for 5.5 hours. So it's all time stamped, so you don't have to watch it all at once. But it was really good talking. It's always fun coming on.
So can they learn about how to be snarky on your channel? Is that
I don't know how to be snarky, so it's they probably couldn't actually.
always good time, Econoboi? Thank you guys so much. From all of us here at the Crucible to all of you sitting wherever you're sitting.